From Tutankhamun's candlelit wedding in Thebes to Cleopatra VII's tense vows beside a teenage brother on the Nile, this is a soothing yet eerie journey that we're about to embark on, lasting over 3 hours. We'll begin with how a fragile boy, king's marriage promised to heal a broken kingdom, and move deeper into why Rome's looming shadow could not break a bond sworn in torchlight. So, put your phone or television remote to the side, dim the lights, and please make sure to like the video, subscribe, and let me know where you are listening from in the comments. Now, let's begin. Tutankhamun, ANKHESENAMUN. The boy pharaoh and his sister wife moved through the moonlit corridors of Thebes like shadows cast by flickering oil lamps, their bare feet silent against the cool limestone floors. Tutankhamun, barely 18 years old, would pause sometimes in the doorways of the great palace, his slight frame draped in the finest linen, watching as ANKHESENAMUN performed her evening rituals before the household shrines. She was perhaps a year younger, her movements graceful and deliberate, as she arranged lotus blossoms before the golden images of their ancestors. Their marriage had been arranged when they were children, both products of the experimental religious city of Amarna, where their father Akhenaten had tried to reshape Egypt's spiritual landscape around the worship of a single god, the Aten. In those sun-drenched years of their early childhood, brother and sister had played together in gardens where papyrus swayed in the desert breeze, their laughter echoing off the carved walls that depicted their family basking in the rays of their father's chosen deity. But Amarna was a dream that couldn't survive its dreamer. When Akhenaten died, the old priests of Thebes emerged from the shadows like patient vultures, ready to restore the ancient ways. The young siblings found themselves at the center of a delicate political dance, their union serving as a bridge between the radical past and the traditional future that Egypt's elite desperately wanted to rebuild. The pressure came softly at first. Whispered conversations in the palace gardens, where advisors spoke of healing the wounds left by Akhenaten's religious revolution. The priests spoke of divine precedent, of how the gods themselves had married within their celestial family to maintain the purity of their bloodline. Sister marriage, they explained in voices smooth as honey, would demonstrate that the royal house had returned to the proper way of things, that the dangerous experiment of Amarna was truly over. Tutankhamun and ANKHESENAMUN's daily life unfolded against the backdrop of a kingdom learning to breathe again after years of upheaval. Their mornings began with the sound of temple chants drifting across the Nile, as the priests of Amun-Ra once again proclaimed their god's supremacy over the land. The young couple would often walk together through the restored precinct of Karnak, where fresh incense burned constantly and the air shimmered with the heat of countless oil lamps. Their evenings were gentler affairs, spent in the palace quarters where musicians played soft melodies on harps and flutes. ANKHESENAMUN had a particular fondness for the ancient stories, and she would often ask the court scribes to read aloud from the papyrus rolls that contained the adventures of the gods and the wisdom of the ancestors. Tutankhamun, despite his youth, showed a keen interest in the practical matters of ruling, poring over tax records and correspondence from distant provinces by the light of bronze lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls. The genetic evidence discovered thousands of years later would paint a complex picture of their family tree. Modern analysis of the mummies, found in the Valley of the Kings, revealed the tangled bloodlines that had characterized the royal family for generations. Tutankhamun and ANKHESENAMUN were likely the children of siblings themselves, their parents caught in the same web of political necessity and religious tradition that now bound them together. The DNA whispered stories of generations of intermarriage, of a royal line that had turned inward upon itself in the quest to maintain divine purity. The boy king's mummy showed signs of the genetic consequences of such unions: a cleft palate, a clubfoot, and a general frailty that may have contributed to his early death. Yet, the historical records suggest that despite these challenges, the young couple found genuine affection in their arranged marriage. Their relationship appears to have been marked by a quiet tenderness that transcended the political calculations that had brought them together. Palace reliefs show them in intimate moments. ANKHESENAMUN, adjusting her husband's collar before a ceremony. TUTANKHAMUN, offering his wife flowers in a garden setting, both of them depicted with the soft, naturalistic style that had emerged during the Amarna period. The end came suddenly, as it often did in ancient Egypt. Tutankhamun died in his 19th year, possibly from complications related to a chariot accident, though the exact cause remains a mystery wrapped in the shadows of the tomb. His death left ANKHESENAMUN in a precarious position, a young widow in a world where women, even queens, had few options for independence. The burial was hurried, perhaps because the embalmers had little time to prepare, or perhaps because the political situation required swift action. ANKHESENAMUN oversaw the funeral preparations with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout their brief marriage. The tomb in the Valley of the Kings was filled with treasures that spoke of their life together: golden furniture, jewelry, and the intimate objects of daily life that would accompany the young pharaoh into the afterlife. In the end, their story was sealed beneath tons of rock and sand, hidden away for over 3,000 years until modern archaeologists brought their tale back into the light. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 revealed not just the wealth of ancient Egypt, but also the human story of two young people who had found love within the constraints of duty and tradition. The soft hush that had fallen over their reign continued even in death. Their names whispered with reverence by the priests who tended their mortuary cult. Their memory preserved in the golden treasures that would one day astonish the world. In the end, they had served their purpose, healing the wounds of Amarna, restoring the old ways, and proving that even in the most unusual circumstances, genuine human connection could flourish. AMENHOTEP I, AHMOSE-MERITAMON. The soft glow of dawn filtered through the palace windows as Amenhotep I and his sister-wife AHMOSE-MERITAMON began their morning rituals in the quiet years following Egypt's liberation from the Hyksos invaders. Their reign represented a gentle interlude in Egyptian history, a time when the kingdom could finally exhale after generations of foreign occupation and civil strife. The couple moved through their palace with the measured grace of those who understood that their primary duty was to heal rather than to conquer. AHMOSE-MERITAMON carried herself with the dignity of someone who had inherited not just a throne, but a sacred responsibility to restore the spiritual fabric of Egypt. Her mother, Queen Ahmose-Nefertari, had been instrumental in the expulsion of the Hyksos, and the daughter felt the weight of that legacy in every gesture. She spent her mornings in the temple complexes, working closely with the priests to re-establish the religious ceremonies that had been disrupted during the years of foreign rule. The palace workshops hummed with quiet activity as artisans labored to repair the damage done to Egypt's temples during the Hyksos period. Under AHMOSE-MERITAMON's watchful eye, skilled craftsmen restored painted reliefs that had been defaced, recarved inscriptions that had been deliberately damaged, and replaced sacred objects that had been destroyed or stolen. The queen understood that these were not merely decorative elements, but the physical manifestations of Egypt's spiritual identity. Amenhotep I, though often overshadowed by his more famous predecessors and successors, possessed a deep appreciation for the delicate work of reconstruction. Unlike the great warrior pharaohs who would follow him, his reign was marked by careful attention to domestic affairs and the patient rebuilding of institutions. He would often join his sister wife in the temple precincts, the two of them walking slowly through the restored halls as evening approached, their footsteps echoing softly against the freshly painted walls. The Nile Valley during their reign took on an almost pastoral quality, with temple festivals returning to their ancient schedules and the great river once again carrying boats laden with offerings to the gods. The royal couple established a routine that reflected their commitment to spiritual restoration. Each morning, They would receive reports from the provinces, carefully reviewing the progress of temple reconstructions and the re-establishment of religious festivals that had been suspended during the period of foreign rule. Their evenings were spent in the palace gardens, where lanterns flickered among the date palms and the sound of water flowing through carefully maintained channels created a soothing backdrop for their conversations. AHMOSE-MERITAMON had a particular gift for weaving together the threads of religious tradition with the practical needs of governance, and she would often spend these quiet hours discussing with her husband how best to restore the ancient ceremonies while adapting them to the changed circumstances of their time. The couple's marriage served multiple purposes beyond the obvious political advantages. Their union represented a return to the old ways, a visible symbol that Egypt had successfully cast off foreign influence and returned to its traditional values. The priests spoke approvingly of their decision to marry within the royal family, seeing it as evidence that the pharaoh understood the importance of maintaining the purity of the divine bloodline. Perhaps more importantly, their marriage provided stability during a period when Egypt was still vulnerable to external threats. The kingdom needed time to recover from the Hyksos occupation, to rebuild its military forces, and to re-establish its diplomatic relationships with neighboring powers. The quiet strength of Amenhotep I and AHMOSE-MERITAMON's partnership gave the kingdom that precious breathing space. The couple's childlessness became a source of gentle speculation among the people, though the court maintained a dignified silence on the matter. Folk stories began to circulate, weaving romantic explanations for their lack of heirs. Some said that the gods had chosen to bless them with eternal youth rather than children. Others whispered that they had been so devoted to restoring Egypt's temples that they had sacrificed their own fertility for the greater good of the kingdom. The truth, as it often is, was likely more prosaic. Their marriage may have been genuinely affectionate, but it was also a political arrangement designed to provide stability during a crucial period of Egyptian history. When they died without direct heirs, the succession passed smoothly to other members of the royal family, suggesting that their union had served its primary purpose of maintaining dynastic continuity. Their legacy lived on in the temples they restored, and the religious traditions they carefully preserved. The mortuary cult that developed around their memory was particularly devoted, with priests continuing to tend their tomb complex at Deir el-Bahari for centuries after their deaths. The whispered prayers and gentle chants that echoed through their memorial chapel spoke of a reign remembered not for great conquests or monumental construction projects, but for the quiet work of healing and restoration. The peaceful nature of their reign created a foundation upon which their successors could build. The temples they restored would serve as the staging grounds for the great military campaigns of later pharaohs. The religious traditions they preserved would provide the spiritual justification for Egypt's expansion into an empire, and the administrative systems they carefully maintained would prove capable of governing territories stretching from Nubia to the Euphrates. In the end, Amenhotep I and AHMOSE-MERITAMON's contribution to Egyptian history was like that of careful gardeners who prepare the soil for future harvests. Their reign was a time of gentle restoration, of whispered prayers in newly rebuilt temples, and of the patient work of cultural renewal that would make possible the glorious achievements of the new kingdom that followed. THUTMOSE II, HATSHEPSUT. The marriage between THUTMOSE II and his half-sister HATSHEPSUT unfolded like a carefully orchestrated drama in the golden halls of Thebes, where the delicate young pharaoh found himself paired with one of the most formidable women in Egyptian history. Their union represented not just a political alliance, but a fascinating study in contrasts: the frail, scholarly king and the confident, statuesque queen who would one day wear the false beard of pharaonic authority. THUTMOSE II had inherited his father's throne, but not his robust constitution. Palace physicians moved quietly through the royal quarters, their leather satchels filled with remedies for the chronic ailments that plagued the young pharaoh. He was a man more comfortable with scrolls than swords, more at home in the temple libraries than on the battlefield. His slight frame was often draped in the finest linens, partly for ceremony but also to ward off the chills that seemed to follow him even in the heat of the Egyptian summer. Hatshepsut, by contrast, commanded attention simply by entering a room. Tall for a woman of her time, she moved with the confidence of someone who had grown up understanding that she was destined for greatness. Her marriage to her half-brother was seen by the court as a perfect complement. Her strength would shore up his weaknesses. Her political acumen would guide his gentle nature, and together they would maintain the divine balance that kept Egypt prosperous. The palace corridors during their reign were perfumed with myrrh and frankincense, brought from the distant land of Punt, evidence of the successful trading expeditions that continued to flow, even as the pharaoh's health remained precarious. Hatshepsut took an active role in these commercial ventures, understanding that Egypt's wealth depended as much on trade as on conquest. She would often be found in the palace workshops, examining samples of exotic goods and discussing trade routes with merchants who had traveled from the far reaches of the known world. Their daily routines reflected the careful balance they had established in their marriage. Mornings often found them together in the Red Chapel, the stunning quartzite shrine that Hatshepsut had commissioned for the god Amun-Ra. The soft light filtering through the polished stone created an atmosphere of divine presence as they performed the daily rituals that maintained the cosmic order. Thutmose too would often lean on his sister wife during these ceremonies, his physical weakness balanced by her spiritual strength. The sounds of temple drums echoed across Thebes during the great festivals, their rhythmic beats providing a soothing counterpoint to the political tensions that simmered beneath the surface of the reign. Hatshepsut had a particular talent for managing these public ceremonies, understanding that the people needed to see their rulers as divinely blessed even when one of them was clearly struggling with mortal frailties. Their marriage was, in many ways, a preparation for what would come after. Hatshepsut used her position as queen to build the networks of support that would later enable her unprecedented rise to full pharaonic power. She cultivated relationships with the priests of Amun, the most powerful religious faction in the kingdom, and she carefully positioned herself as the guardian of traditional Egyptian values, even as she prepared to break one of the most fundamental traditions of all. The couple's partnership extended beyond the ceremonial into the practical aspects of governing. When Thutmose II was too ill to attend court sessions, Hatshepsut would often take his place, her authoritative voice echoing through the audience halls as she heard petitions and rendered judgments. The court officials gradually became accustomed to seeing the queen act with pharaonic authority, a familiarity that would prove crucial when she later claimed the throne in her own right. Their relationship appears to have been built on mutual respect, rather than passionate love. Thutmose II seems to have recognized his wife's superior political skills and was content to let her handle many of the duties that his failing health made difficult. Hatshepsut, in turn, appears to have been genuinely protective of her husband, shielding him from the more demanding aspects of royal life, while ensuring that his reign was remembered as a time of peace and prosperity. The religious aspect of their marriage was particularly significant. As sister and brother, they represented the divine principle of duality that was central to Egyptian theology. The gods themselves were often depicted as sibling pairs, and the royal couple's union was seen as an earthly reflection of cosmic harmony. This theological framework would later provide Hatshepsut with part of the justification for her assumption of full pharaonic power. When Thutmose II died after a brief reign, Hatshepsut found herself in the position of regent for her young stepson, Thutmose III, but her years as queen had prepared her for something more ambitious. The networks she had built, the relationships she had cultivated, and the administrative experience she had gained all contributed to her eventual decision to become pharaoh in her own right. Her later reign as pharaoh cast a gentle retrospective light on her marriage to Thutmose II. What had once been seen as a traditional sister marriage, designed to provide stability, now appeared as the first step in one of the most remarkable political careers in ancient history. The quiet partnership between the scholarly pharaoh and his ambitious sister wife had been In retrospect, a period of preparation for one of Egypt's most successful rulers. The legacy of their union lived on in the temples Hatshepsut built, and the trade relationships she established. The myrrh trees she had brought from Punt still grew in the temple gardens, their fragrant resin continuing to perfume the air around the monuments she had erected. In the end, their marriage had served its purpose, not just as a political alliance, but as the foundation for one of the most prosperous periods in Egyptian history. Ptolemy of Philopator, ARSINOE III. The rose petals drifted lazily from the perfumed ceilings of the palace banquet halls, their soft pink and white fragments settling like snow on the marble floors where Ptolemy IV, Philopator, reclined beside his sister wife ARSINOE III. The fourth Ptolemy had inherited an empire at its zenith, but his temperament was better suited to the pleasures of the symposium than the rigors of statecraft. Wine flowed freely in golden cups, and the air shimmered with the heat of countless oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls decorated with scenes of Dionysiac revelry. ARSINOE III possessed the sharp intellect that seemed to skip generations in the Ptolemaic line, appearing when the dynasty most needed it. While her husband lost himself in philosophical debates that lasted until dawn, she quietly managed the correspondence that kept the empire functioning. Her apartments were filled with papyrus scrolls bearing reports from administrators throughout Egypt and the Eastern Mediterranean, and she would often spend her mornings translating between the various languages spoken throughout their diverse kingdom. The contrast between the royal siblings was evident to anyone who observed them during their daily routines. Ptolemy IV would often be found in the palace gardens, discussing poetry with visiting scholars or experimenting with new varieties of wine brought from the Greek islands. His interests ranged from literature to mathematics, but he approached them all with the leisurely air of someone who had never had to worry about practical consequences. The weight of empire sat lightly on his shoulders, perhaps too lightly for the challenging times ahead. ARSINOE III, meanwhile, moved through the palace with the purposeful stride of someone who understood that someone had to mind the store while her husband pursued his intellectual pleasures. She had developed close relationships with the military commanders and provincial governors, understanding that her husband's lack of interest in administrative details created both opportunities and dangers. Her correspondence with these officials was marked by a careful balance of encouragement and warning, keeping the machinery of government functioning while her husband remained blissfully unaware of many of the details. Their sibling marriage had been arranged as much for diplomatic reasons as dynastic ones. The Ptolemaic kingdom faced pressure from both the Seleucid Empire to the east and the rising power of Rome to the west. A unified royal house, symbolized by the marriage of brother and sister, was meant to project strength and stability to potential enemies and allies alike. The court ceremonies that celebrated their union were elaborate affairs, with Egyptian priests and Greek philosophers combining their traditions to create rituals that honored both the ancient customs of the Nile Valley and the newer influences brought by Alexander's conquest. The palace libraries during their reign became centers of both learning and luxury. Ptolemy IV had commissioned scribes to copy works from throughout the known world, but he was just as likely to use these precious scrolls as props for dramatic recitations during his evening entertainments. ARSINOE III, with her more practical mind, ensured that copies were made of the most important works. Understanding that her husband's casual approach to these irreplaceable texts posed a constant threat to the collection. Their most significant test came with the invasion of Antiochus III, the Seleucid king who sought to reclaim the territories in Palestine and southern Syria that had been disputed between the two empires for generations. The Battle of Raphia in 217 BCE would prove to be the defining moment of their reign, though few at the court initially understood the gravity of the situation. Ptolemy IV approached the crisis with his usual philosophical detachment, while ARSINOE III quietly organized the resources that would make victory possible. The queen's role in the Raphia campaign demonstrated her true capabilities. While her husband consulted oracles and commissioned poets, to write victory hymns before the battle had even been fought. She worked with the generals to ensure that the army was properly supplied and equipped. Her personal correspondence from this period, preserved in the palace archives, reveals a sharp military mind that understood both the strategic importance of the coming battle and the practical details necessary for success. The victory at Raphia was celebrated throughout Alexandria with festivals that lasted for weeks. Rose petals were scattered in the streets, and the palace banquets reached new heights of extravagance. Ptolemy IV basked in the adulation, genuinely surprised to find himself celebrated as a military hero. Arsinoe III, understanding better than her husband how close they had come to disaster, used the victory celebrations to strengthen her relationships with the military commanders who had made the triumph possible. The aftermath of Raphia, however, revealed the underlying weaknesses in Ptolemaic rule. The Egyptian soldiers who had fought in the battle returned home with a new sense of their own importance, having proven that native troops could defeat the professional armies of the other successor kingdoms. This military awakening would eventually lead to rebellions that would plague the later Ptolemies, but for the moment, the royal couple could enjoy their triumph in the scented gardens of Alexandria. Their marriage appears to have been one of genuine affection, despite the obvious differences in their temperaments. Palace observers noted that Arsinoe III never showed public impatience with her husband's indulgences, while Ptolemy IV seemed genuinely grateful for his wife's assistance in managing the burden of rule. Their evening conversations, conducted on the palace terraces overlooking the harbor, were said to range from poetry to politics, with the queen gently steering her husband toward the issues that required royal attention. The end came suddenly and violently, as it so often did in the Ptolemaic court. Both Ptolemy IV and Arsinoe III died within a short period, possibly victims of the palace conspiracies that would become increasingly common in the later dynasty. Their young son inherited a kingdom that appeared prosperous and stable, but the underlying tensions that would eventually tear the empire apart were already beginning to manifest. The rose-scented memory of their reign would be preserved in the court poetry and the architectural monuments they had commissioned, but the real legacy of Ptolemy IV and Arsinoe III lay in the precedent they had set for the division of royal responsibilities. Future Ptolemaic queens would often find themselves serving as the practical administrators, while their husbands pursued other interests, a pattern that would both strengthen and ultimately doom the dynasty. Ptolemy of Philopator, Arsinoe III. The rose petals drifted lazily from the perfumed ceilings of the palace banquet halls, their soft pink and white fragments settling like snow on the marble floors where Ptolemy IV, Philopator, reclined beside his sister wife Arsinoe III. The fourth Ptolemy had inherited an empire at its zenith, but his temperament was better suited to the pleasures of the symposium than the rigors of statecraft. Wine flowed freely in golden cups, and the air shimmered with the heat of countless oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls decorated with scenes of Dionysiac revelry. Arsinoe III possessed the sharp intellect that seemed to skip generations in the Ptolemaic line, appearing when the dynasty most needed it. While her husband lost himself in philosophical debates that lasted until dawn, she quietly managed the correspondence that kept the empire functioning. Her apartments were filled with papyrus scrolls bearing reports from administrators throughout Egypt and the Eastern Mediterranean, and she would often spend her mornings translating between the various languages spoken throughout their diverse kingdom. The contrast between the royal siblings was evident to anyone who observed them during their daily routines. Ptolemy IV would often be found in the palace gardens, discussing poetry with visiting scholars or experimenting with new varieties of wine brought from the Greek islands. His interests ranged from literature to mathematics, but he approached them all with the leisurely air of someone who had never had to worry about practical consequences. The weight of empire sat lightly on his shoulders, perhaps too lightly for the challenging times ahead. Arsinoe III, meanwhile, moved through the palace with the purposeful stride of someone who understood that someone had to mind the store while her husband pursued his intellectual pleasures. She had developed close relationships with the military commanders and provincial governors, understanding that her husband's lack of interest in administrative details created both opportunities and dangers. Her correspondence with these officials was marked by a careful balance of encouragement and warning, keeping the machinery of government functioning while her husband remained blissfully unaware of many of the details. Their sibling marriage had been arranged as much for diplomatic reasons as dynastic ones. The Ptolemaic kingdom faced pressure from both the Seleucid Empire to the east and the rising power of Rome to the west. A unified royal house, symbolized by the marriage of brother and sister, was meant to project strength and stability to potential enemies and allies alike. The court ceremonies that celebrated their union were elaborate affairs, with Egyptian priests and Greek philosophers combining their traditions to create rituals that honored both the ancient customs of the Nile Valley and the newer influences brought by Alexander's conquest. The palace libraries during their reign became centers of both learning and luxury. Ptolemy IV had commissioned scribes to copy works from throughout the known world, but he was just as likely to use these precious scrolls as props for dramatic recitations during his evening entertainments. ARSINOE III, with her more practical mind, ensured that copies were made of the most important works. Understanding that her husband's casual approach to these irreplaceable texts posed a constant threat to the collection. Their most significant test came with the invasion of Antiochus III, the Seleucid king who sought to reclaim the territories in Palestine and southern Syria that had been disputed between the two empires for generations. The Battle of Raphia in 217 BCE would prove to be the defining moment of their reign, though few at the court initially understood the gravity of the situation. Ptolemy IV approached the crisis with his usual philosophical detachment, while Arsinoe III quietly organized the resources that would make victory possible. The queen's role in the Raphia campaign demonstrated her true capabilities. While her husband consulted oracles and commissioned poets to write victory hymns before the battle had even been fought, she worked with the generals to ensure that the army was properly supplied and equipped. Her personal correspondence from this period, preserved in the palace archives, reveals a sharp military mind that understood both the strategic importance of the coming battle and the practical details necessary for success. The victory at Raphia was celebrated throughout Alexandria with festivals that lasted for weeks. Rose petals were scattered in the streets, and the palace banquets reached new heights of extravagance. Ptolemy IV basked in the adulation, genuinely surprised to find himself celebrated as a military hero. Arsinoe III, understanding better than her husband how close they had come to disaster, used the victory celebrations to strengthen her relationships with the military commanders who had made the triumph possible. The aftermath of Raphia, however, revealed the underlying weaknesses in Ptolemaic rule. The Egyptian soldiers who had fought in the battle returned home with a new sense of their own importance, having proven that native troops could defeat the professional armies of the other successor kingdoms. This military awakening would eventually lead to rebellions that would plague the later Ptolemies, but for the moment, the royal couple could enjoy their triumph in the scented gardens of Alexandria. Their marriage appears to have been one of genuine affection, despite the obvious differences in their temperaments. Palace observers noted that Arsinoe III never showed public impatience with her husband's indulgences, while Ptolemy IV seemed genuinely grateful for his wife's assistance in managing the burden of rule. Their evening conversations, conducted on the palace terraces overlooking the harbor, were said to range from poetry to politics, with the queen gently steering her husband toward the issues that required royal attention. The end came suddenly and violently, as it so often did in the Ptolemaic court. Both Ptolemy IV and Arsinoe III died within a short period, possibly victims of the palace conspiracies that would become increasingly common in the later dynasty. Their young son inherited a kingdom that appeared prosperous and stable, but the underlying tensions that would eventually tear the empire apart were already beginning to manifest. the rose-scented memory of their reign would be preserved in the court poetry and the architectural monuments they had commissioned, but the real legacy of Ptolemy IV and Arsinoe III lay in the precedent they had set for the division of royal responsibilities. Future Ptolemaic queens would often find themselves serving as the practical administrators, while their husbands pursued other interests, a pattern that would both strengthen and ultimately doom the dynasty. Cleopatra II, Ptolemy, v. Philometor. The papyrus pools in the palace gardens whispered softly in the morning breeze as young Cleopatra II and her brother Ptolemy VI played the ancient games of royal children, unaware that their childhood bond would one day become the foundation for one of the most enduring partnerships in Ptolemaic history. Their laughter echoed through the colonnaded courtyards of Alexandria, where nurses and tutors watched indulgently as the future rulers of Egypt chased each other through the carefully tended groves of date palms and sycamores. Brother and sister were inseparable from their earliest years, a closeness that worried some of the court officials who understood that such emotional bonds could complicate the political calculations that would eventually govern their lives. But their mother, Cleopatra I, had ruled successfully as regent, and she saw in her children's affection a potential source of strength rather than weakness. The royal apartments were filled with the sounds of their shared lessons, as Greek tutors taught them the poetry of Homer, while Egyptian priests instructed them in the ancient wisdom of the pharaohs. When the time came for their marriage, it seemed as natural as the annual flooding of the Nile. They had grown up understanding that they were destined to rule together, that their individual strengths would complement each other in the complex task of governing an empire that stretched from the cataracts of Nubia to the mountains of Asia Minor. The wedding ceremony took place in the great temple of Pa in Memphis, where the ancient ritual of pharaonic marriage was performed before crowds of Egyptian subjects who saw in the union a return to the traditional ways of their ancestors. Their co-regency was marked by an unusual degree of harmony for the often fractious Ptolemaic dynasty. Twin thrones were placed beneath diaphanous canopies in the palace audience halls, where the royal siblings would hear petitions and render judgments together. Their voices would often blend as they discussed the cases brought before them, with Cleopatra II's sharp legal mind complementing her brother's more intuitive approach to human nature. The palace during their early reign had an almost dreamlike quality, with the Mediterranean light filtering through silk hangings and the constant sound of fountains creating an atmosphere of serene prosperity. Scribes moved quietly through the corridors, carrying scrolls that bore the joint seals of both rulers, evidence of their collaborative approach to governance. The royal couple had established a routine of morning conferences where they would review the business of the empire over breakfasts of fresh bread, honey, and fruit from the palace gardens. Their happiness was tested when the shadows of war began to gather on the eastern horizon. Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, the Seleucid king, had launched an invasion of Egypt that threatened to end Ptolemaic independence forever. The royal siblings found themselves facing their first major crisis together, spending long nights in strategy sessions by the light of oil lamps that flickered against the maps spread across their council tables. The invasion brought out the best in both rulers. Ptolemy VI proved himself capable of the hard decisions that war demanded, while Cleopatra II demonstrated her talent for the complex diplomacy that would ultimately save their kingdom. Her correspondence with foreign courts during this period shows a sophisticated understanding of the balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean, as she worked to build the coalition that would eventually force Antiochus to withdraw. The siege of Alexandria tested their partnership in ways that peacetime governance never could. As Seleucid forces approached the walls of their capital, the royal couple could be seen making daily rounds of the fortifications, their presence serving to reassure both soldiers and civilians that their rulers had not abandoned them. Cleopatra II was particularly effective in these morale-building exercises, her calm demeanor providing a striking contrast to the chaos and fear that gripped much of the city. Their moment of greatest triumph came not through military victory, but through diplomatic cunning. Roman intervention, carefully orchestrated through Cleopatra II's negotiations, forced Antiochus to abandon his Egyptian adventure. The famous scene of the Roman senator drawing a circle in the sand around the Seleucid king and demanding an immediate answer to Roman terms became a symbol of the new reality in the Eastern Mediterranean, but it was also a testament to the diplomatic skills of the Ptolemaic queen. The public festivals that celebrated their survival were marked by elaborate pageantry that portrayed the royal siblings as the divine twins, blessed by the gods, and destined to rule together in harmony. Musicians played gentle melodies on lyres and flutes while processions of priests carried the sacred symbols of Egyptian and Greek religion through the streets of Alexandria. The celebrations lasted for days, with the palace kitchens working around the clock to provide the feasts that marked each evening's festivities. Their marriage appears to have been genuinely happy, one of the rare Ptolemaic unions where political necessity aligned with personal affection. Palace observers noted the easy intimacy between the royal couple, the way they would finish each other's sentences during court sessions, and their obvious delight in each other's company during the informal moments that punctuated their busy days. The later years of their reign were marked by increasing challenges, as native Egyptian rebellions and renewed Seleucid pressure tested the stability they had worked so hard to maintain. A brief period of exile forced them to rely entirely on each other, strengthening their bond even as it revealed the fragility of their position. Their return to Alexandria was greeted with genuine popular enthusiasm, evidence that their subjects had come to appreciate the stability their partnership provided. The gradual decline that marked the end of their joint reign was all the more poignant because of the happiness that had preceded it. Age and the accumulated stress of ruling took their toll on both partners, but they faced these challenges with the same mutual support that had characterized their entire relationship. Their deaths, coming within a few years of each other, marked the end of one of the most successful partnerships in Ptolemaic history. The memory of their reign would be preserved in the temples they had restored and the festivals they had established, but perhaps more importantly, in the model they had created for how royal siblings could work together effectively. Future generations of Ptolemaic rulers would look back on their partnership as a golden age when brother and sister had truly ruled as one. Cleopatra II, Ptolemy, v. Philometor. The papyrus pools in the palace gardens whispered softly in the morning breeze as young Cleopatra II and her brother Ptolemy VI played the ancient games of royal children, unaware that their childhood bond would one day become the foundation for one of the most enduring partnerships in Ptolemaic history. Their laughter echoed through the colonnaded courtyards of Alexandria, where nurses and tutors watched indulgently as the future rulers of Egypt chased each other through the carefully tended groves of date palms and sycamores. Brother and sister were inseparable from their earliest years, a closeness that worried some of the court officials who understood that such emotional bonds could complicate the political calculations that would eventually govern their lives. But their mother, Cleopatra I, had ruled successfully as regent, and she saw in her children's affection a potential source of strength rather than weakness. The royal apartments were filled with the sounds of their shared lessons, as Greek tutors taught them the poetry of Homer, while Egyptian priests instructed them in the ancient wisdom of the pharaohs. When the time came for their marriage, it seemed as natural as the annual flooding of the Nile. They had grown up understanding that they were destined to rule together, that their individual strengths would complement each other in the complex task of governing an empire that stretched from the cataracts of Nubia to the mountains of Asia Minor. The wedding ceremony took place in the great temple of Pa in Memphis, where the ancient ritual of pharaonic marriage was performed before crowds of Egyptian subjects who saw in the union a return to the traditional ways of their ancestors. Their co-regency was marked by an unusual degree of harmony for the often fractious Ptolemaic dynasty. Twin thrones were placed beneath diaphanous canopies in the palace audience halls, where the royal siblings would hear petitions and render judgments together. Their voices would often blend as they discussed the cases brought before them, with Cleopatra II's sharp legal mind complementing her brother's more intuitive approach to human nature. The palace during their early reign had an almost dreamlike quality, with the Mediterranean light filtering through silk hangings and the constant sound of fountains creating an atmosphere of serene prosperity. Scribes moved quietly through the corridors, carrying scrolls that bore the joint seals of both rulers, evidence of their collaborative approach to governance. The royal couple had established a routine of morning conferences where they would review the business of the empire over breakfasts of fresh bread, honey, and fruit from the palace gardens. Their happiness was tested when the shadows of war began to gather on the eastern horizon. Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, the Seleucid king, had launched an invasion of Egypt that threatened to end Ptolemaic independence forever. The royal siblings found themselves facing their first major crisis together, spending long nights in strategy sessions by the light of oil lamps that flickered against the maps spread across their council tables. The invasion brought out the best in both rulers. Ptolemy VI proved himself capable of the hard decisions that war demanded, while Cleopatra II demonstrated her talent for the complex diplomacy that would ultimately save their kingdom. Her correspondence with foreign courts during this period shows a sophisticated understanding of the balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean, as she worked to build the coalition that would eventually force Antiochus to withdraw. The siege of Alexandria tested their partnership in ways that peacetime governance never could. As Seleucid forces approached the walls of their capital, the royal couple could be seen making daily rounds of the fortifications, their presence serving to reassure both soldiers and civilians that their rulers had not abandoned them. Cleopatra too was particularly effective in these morale-building exercises, her calm demeanor providing a striking contrast to the chaos and fear that gripped much of the city. Their moment of greatest triumph came not through military victory, but through diplomatic cunning. Roman intervention, carefully orchestrated through Cleopatra II's negotiations, forced Antiochus to abandon his Egyptian adventure. The famous scene of the Roman senator drawing a circle in the sand around the Seleucid king and demanding an immediate answer to Roman terms became a symbol of the new reality in the Eastern Mediterranean, but it was also a testament to the diplomatic skills of the Ptolemaic queen. The public festivals that celebrated their survival were marked by elaborate pageantry that portrayed the royal siblings as the divine twins, blessed by the gods, and destined to rule together in harmony. Musicians played gentle melodies on lyres and flutes while processions of priests carried the sacred symbols of Egyptian and Greek religion through the streets of Alexandria. The celebrations lasted for days, with the palace kitchens working around the clock to provide the feasts that marked each evening's festivities. Their marriage appears to have been genuinely happy, one of the rare Ptolemaic unions where political necessity aligned with personal affection. Palace observers noted the easy intimacy between the royal couple, the way they would finish each other's sentences during court sessions, and their obvious delight in each other's company during the informal moments that punctuated their busy days. The later years of their reign were marked by increasing challenges, as native Egyptian rebellions and renewed Seleucid pressure tested the stability they had worked so hard to maintain. A brief period of exile forced them to rely entirely on each other, strengthening their bond even as it revealed the fragility of their position. Their return to Alexandria was greeted with genuine popular enthusiasm, evidence that their subjects had come to appreciate the stability their partnership provided. The gradual decline that marked the end of their joint reign was all the more poignant because of the happiness that had preceded it. Age and the accumulated stress of ruling took their toll on both partners, but they faced these challenges with the same mutual support that had characterized their entire relationship. Their deaths, coming within a few years of each other, marked the end of one of the most successful partnerships in Ptolemaic history. The memory of their reign would be preserved in the temples they had restored and the festivals they had established, but perhaps more importantly, in the model they had created for how royal siblings could work together effectively. Future generations of Ptolemaic rulers would look back on their partnership as a golden age when brother and sister had truly ruled as one. Cleopatra VII, Ptolemy XIII. The star-bright torches reflected off the dark waters of the Nile. As the royal barge carried Cleopatra VII and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. Through the ceremonial waters that had witnessed so many Ptolemaic unions before, theirs, the last great queen of Egypt, sat beside the nervous boy, who was both her brother and her husband, her silk garments rustling softly in the evening breeze as she contemplated the political necessities that had brought them to this moment. At 18, she already possessed the charisma and intelligence that would make her legendary, while her 10-year-old brother seemed overwhelmed by the weight of expectations that pressed down upon their young shoulders. The marriage had been arranged according to the ancient customs of their dynasty, but it took place in a kingdom that was increasingly overshadowed by the growing power of Rome. The palace at Alexandria buzzed with the constant activity of diplomats and merchants from across the Mediterranean world, all seeking to position themselves advantageously as the Ptolemaic kingdom struggled to maintain its independence. Cleopatra VII moved through this complex environment with the confidence of someone who had been raised to rule, while Ptolemy XIII remained largely in the background of the great events that swirled around them. Their evening routines provided a striking contrast in personalities and interests. Cleopatra VII would often spend her nights in the great library, her melodious voice reading aloud from the works of Homer, Sappho, and the great historians whose scrolls filled the palace collection. She had mastered not only Greek and Egyptian, but also Latin, Hebrew, and several other languages that would prove useful in her later diplomatic career. Her young husband, meanwhile, seemed more interested in the games and toys appropriate to his age, though he struggled to understand the serious responsibilities that had been thrust upon him. The Queen's intelligence was already legendary among the scholars who frequented the palace. She could discuss philosophy with visiting academics, negotiate trade agreements with foreign merchants, and debate theology with Egyptian priests, all with an ease that suggested natural genius rather than mere education. Her ability to switch effortlessly between languages during the same conversation impressed even the cosmopolitan courtiers of Alexandria, who had grown accustomed to the intellectual achievements of Ptolemaic rulers. Ptolemy XIII, by contrast, was still very much a child, despite his royal titles. Palace tutors worked patiently to prepare him for the responsibilities he would one day inherit, but his attention often wandered during lessons on statecraft and military strategy. The boy seemed more comfortable in the palace gardens, where he could play with the exotic animals that were kept as symbols of Egypt's wealth and power, than in the council chambers where the fate of the kingdom was decided. The Roman presence in Egypt cast a shadow over every aspect of their reign, with senators and generals arriving regularly to remind the Ptolemies of their dependent status. Cleopatra VII handled these visits with diplomatic skill that belied her youth, entertaining Roman officials with lavish banquets while carefully avoiding any commitments that might compromise Egypt's remaining autonomy. Her brother's role in these encounters was largely ceremonial, though his presence served to legitimize her authority according to the traditional forms of Ptolemaic rule. The palace library became Cleopatra VII's refuge from the pressures of joint rule with a child husband who could contribute little to the serious business of governance. She would often retreat to the quiet reading rooms where the accumulated wisdom of centuries was preserved on papyrus scrolls, seeking guidance from the philosophers and historians whose works had survived the centuries. These scholarly pursuits were not mere intellectual exercises, but practical preparation for the challenges she knew lay ahead. The growing tension between the royal siblings became apparent as Ptolemy XIII's advisors began to assert more influence over the young king. These men, led by the eunuch Pothinus and the general Achilles, represented the faction of Egyptian nobles who preferred to accommodate Roman demands rather than risk the consequences of resistance. They viewed Cleopatra VII's more assertive approach to foreign policy as dangerous and began to position themselves to marginalize her influence. The sibling marriage that was supposed to provide stability for the Ptolemaic dynasty instead became the focus of the power struggle that would ultimately tear it apart. Court ceremonies that should have celebrated royal unity became exercises in political theater, with each faction seeking to demonstrate their influence over the young king. Cleopatra VII found herself increasingly isolated as her brother's advisors worked to turn him against her. The civil war that eventually erupted between the royal siblings was as much about competing visions for Egypt's future as it was about personal ambition. Cleopatra VII believed that Egypt could maintain its independence through clever diplomacy and strategic alliances, while Ptolemy XIII's faction argued that accommodation with Rome offered the best hope for preserving what remained of Ptolemaic power. The marriage that had been intended to unite these competing approaches instead became the vehicle for their violent confrontation. The cool marble halls of the palace library took on an almost sacred quality during the final days before Caesar's arrival, as Cleopatra VII spent her last hours in Alexandria among the scrolls that represented the intellectual legacy of her dynasty. She understood that her meeting with the Roman general would determine not only her personal fate, but the future of the kingdom that had been built by her ancestors. The nervous energy of the palace, with guards moving restlessly through corridors and advisors whispering urgently in shadowed corners, stood in sharp contrast to the timeless serenity of the Great Collection. The dramatic end of their sibling marriage came with Cleopatra VII's famous meeting with Julius Caesar, an encounter that would reshape the political landscape of the entire Mediterranean world. The young queen's intelligence and charisma proved more than a match for Roman ambition, while her brother's faction found themselves outmaneuvered by forces they had never fully understood. The palace that had witnessed so many Ptolemaic weddings now became the stage for the final act of a dynasty that had ruled Egypt for 3 centuries. The legacy of their brief marriage lay not in any achievements they had accomplished together, but in the way their conflict had prepared Cleopatra VII for the greater challenges that lay ahead. The experience of ruling with an unequal partner, of navigating the treacherous waters of palace politics, and of facing the reality of Roman power had all contributed to the education of a queen who would become one of history's most remarkable figures. Cleopatra VII, Ptolemy XIII. The dim temple lanterns cast dancing shadows across the sacred precinct as Cleopatra VII prepared for her second sibling wedding, this time to Ptolemy XIV, a boy even younger than her previous brother-husband. The ceremony took place in the hushed atmosphere that had settled over Alexandria following the violent end of the civil war with Ptolemy XIII. The queen, now firmly established in her power through her alliance with Julius Caesar, moved through the ancient rituals with the practiced grace of someone who understood that this marriage was merely another diplomatic necessity in the complex game of maintaining legitimacy. Ptolemy XIV was barely 12 years old when he found himself elevated to the position of co-ruler and husband, a child thrust into circumstances that would have challenged someone twice his age. Unlike his predecessor, who had been manipulated by ambitious advisors into opposing his sister, the younger boy seemed content to remain in Cleopatra VII's shadow. The palace corridors echoed with the sound of his tutors' voices as they attempted to provide him with the education necessary for his nominal role as pharaoh, though everyone understood that real power rested entirely with his sister wife. The presence of Julius Caesar's retinue transformed the palace into something resembling a Roman camp more than an Egyptian royal residence. Legionnaires in their distinctive armor stood guard at entrances that had once been protected by Macedonian soldiers, while Latin conversations echoed through halls where Greek had been the language of power for 3 centuries. Cleopatra VII navigated this cultural transformation with characteristic skill, serving as translator and intermediary between the Roman occupation forces and her Egyptian subjects. Their marriage existed in the strange twilight of nominal independence and actual subjugation that characterized Egypt during this period. Public ceremonies still followed the traditional forms of Ptolemaic rule, with brother and sister appearing together on official occasions to maintain the fiction of joint governance. But private conversations between the royal couple were dominated by Cleopatra VII's explanations of the political realities that now governed their kingdom. As she tried to prepare her young brother for a world where Egyptian independence was rapidly becoming a historical curiosity, the palace gardens provided a refuge from the political pressures that surrounded them. and it was here that the royal siblings could sometimes recapture something resembling a normal relationship. Cleopatra VII would often spend her afternoons walking with Ptolemy XIV among the exotic plants and fountains, using these quiet moments to continue his education in languages, history, and the subtle arts of diplomacy. The boy showed promise in his studies, though his youth made it impossible to predict what kind of ruler he might have become under different circumstances. Their country retreats to the Fayum region offered another escape from the intensity of Alexandrian politics. The lily-scented lakes and peaceful marshlands of this fertile oasis provided a striking contrast to the urban complexity of the capital, where every conversation carried political implications and every gesture was scrutinized for its diplomatic significance. During these rural interludes, the royal couple could almost pretend that they were simply brother and sister enjoying a holiday, rather than the last representatives of a dynasty caught in the web of Roman expansion. The long, contemplative silences that marked these retreats reflected the strange position in which both siblings found themselves. Cleopatra VII was already planning the moves that would eventually lead to her relationship with Mark Antony, while Ptolemy XIV was struggling to understand his role in a kingdom where the traditional sources of power had been fundamentally altered by Roman intervention. Their conversations during these quiet periods revealed a genuine affection between them, despite the vast differences in their ages and capabilities. The administrative routine of their joint reign was carefully orchestrated to maintain the appearance of traditional Ptolemaic governance, while accommodating the realities of Roman oversight. Palace scribes produced documents bearing both of their seals, though everyone understood that Cleopatra VII made all the important decisions. Ptolemy XIV's involvement in government was largely ceremonial, consisting mainly of his presence at public events and his signature on documents that had already been approved by his sister. The young king's brief independent reign, following Cleopatra VII's departure for Rome, demonstrated both his potential and his limitations. Palace records from this period show that he attempted to govern according to the principles his sister had taught him. But the challenges of ruling Egypt in the midst of Roman civil wars proved too complex for someone of his youth and inexperience. The correspondence between the royal siblings during their separation reveals Cleopatra VII's concern for her brother's welfare and her attempts to guide his decisions from a distance. The mysterious circumstances surrounding Ptolemy XIV's death added another layer of tragedy to the already complex story of the last Ptolemaic generation. Whether he died of natural causes or was eliminated to clear the way for Cleopatra VII's plans with Mark Antony remains a subject of historical speculation. What is certain is that his death marked the end of the traditional Ptolemaic practice of sibling marriage, as Cleopatra VII would spend her remaining years focused on her relationships with Roman leaders rather than Egyptian dynastic politics. The brief fade that characterized Ptolemy XIV's reign and life reflected the broader decline of Ptolemaic power during this period. The ancient customs and ceremonies that had sustained the dynasty for 3 centuries were increasingly becoming empty forms, maintained for their symbolic value but stripped of their real political significance. The sound of Alexandria's restless surf, constantly beating against the harbor walls, seemed to echo the relentless pressure of historical forces that were reshaping the Mediterranean world. The palace staff, who had served multiple generations of Ptolemaic rulers, noted the changed atmosphere during this final sibling marriage. The easy confidence that had characterized earlier royal partnerships was replaced by a sense of uncertainty about the future. Servants whispered among themselves about the meaning of the Roman presence and speculated about what would happen to Egypt when the last of the Ptolemies was gone. The cultural significance of Cleopatra VII and Ptolemy XIV's marriage lay not in what it accomplished, but in what it represented, the final chapter of a tradition that had shaped Egyptian royal practice for centuries. Their union marked the end of an era when Egyptian pharaohs could still pretend to rule as equals among the powers of the Mediterranean world, before the reality of Roman domination made such pretenses impossible to maintain. The memory of their partnership would be preserved in the palace archives and the accounts of contemporary observers, serving as a testament to the resilience of individuals caught in the tide of historical change. Despite the vast forces arrayed against them, Cleopatra VII and Ptolemy XIV had managed to maintain their dignity and their commitment to Egypt's welfare, even as the world they had inherited was transformed beyond recognition around them. Amenhotep III's royal sister wives. Tradition. The golden dusk courtyards of Malkata Palace glowed with the warm light of oil lamps as Amenhotep III presided over the most magnificent court of the ancient world, where the tradition of royal sister marriage had evolved into an art form of diplomatic sophistication. The great pharaoh, ruler during Egypt's zenith of wealth and power, had transformed the ancient custom into a cornerstone of international relations, using marriage alliances with his own sisters and daughters to cement the divine nature of his rule, while maintaining Egypt's position as the dominant power of the Eastern Mediterranean. The earlier 18th dynasty had established the precedent for these unions through a combination of religious necessity and political pragmatism. The pharaohs who had expelled the Hyksos and rebuilt Egypt's empire understood that their legitimacy depended partly on their ability to demonstrate their divine nature, and marriage within the royal family provided theological justification for claims that went beyond mere political authority. Palace priests had developed elaborate ceremonies that celebrated these unions as earthly reflections of the cosmic marriages among the gods themselves. The palace workshops during Amenhotep III's reign hummed with the creation of objects that would symbolize and celebrate these royal unions. Master craftsmen worked with gold and precious stones to create the elaborate jewelry and ceremonial objects that would mark each wedding, while scribes composed hymns and prayers that would accompany the rituals. The artistic production of this period reflected the confident prosperity of a kingdom that could afford to turn even marriage ceremonies into demonstrations of Egypt's cultural supremacy. The succession worries that had plagued earlier dynasties were largely alleviated by the carefully orchestrated system of multiple marriages that Amenhotep III had perfected. By marrying his sisters and ensuring that his daughters also married within the royal family, he created a web of relationships that made it virtually impossible for anyone outside the immediate royal circle to challenge the legitimacy of his heirs. The practice served as both insurance against dynastic instability and proof of the pharaoh's special relationship with the divine realm. The architectural setting for these ceremonies reflected the cosmic significance that Egyptian theology attached to royal sibling marriages. The great temples of Thebes were decorated with scenes that depicted the pharaoh and his sister wives participating in rituals that maintained the harmony between the earthly and divine realms. The carved reliefs showed twin cobras embracing beneath sun discs, symbolic representations of the royal couples whose unions ensured the continuation of divine rule on earth. The incense-filled Sed festivals that marked the pharaoh's periodic renewal became the occasions for the most elaborate celebrations of these royal marriages. Every few years, the court would gather for ceremonies that lasted for weeks, during which the pharaoh's divine nature was ritually renewed, and his marriages were celebrated as evidence of his continued favor with the gods. The air during these festivals was thick with the smoke of frankincense and myrrh, while the sound of temple chants echoed across the Nile Valley. The international dimension of Amenhotep III's reign added another layer of significance to these domestic arrangements. Foreign rulers who sought alliances with Egypt were required to acknowledge the special nature of the pharaoh's family relationships, understanding that these marriages were not merely personal arrangements, but fundamental aspects of Egyptian royal ideology. The diplomatic correspondence from this period shows how carefully foreign courts navigated the theological implications of their relationships with a ruler who claimed divine status partly on the basis of his family arrangements. The palace life during this golden age was marked by a refinement and luxury that reflected Egypt's unprecedented prosperity. The royal wives, whether sisters or foreign princesses, lived in apartments decorated with the finest art of the period. Their daily routines, structured around ceremonies that reinforced their roles in maintaining cosmic harmony. The evening gatherings in the palace gardens brought together the intellectual and artistic elite of the ancient world, creating an environment where poetry, philosophy, and religious speculation flourished under royal patronage. The artistic motifs that decorated the palaces and temples of this period provided a visual vocabulary for understanding the significance of royal sibling marriage. Twin cobras were frequently depicted embracing beneath solar discs, their intertwined forms representing the harmonious union of male and female divine principles. These images appeared on everything from monumental temple walls to delicate pieces of jewelry, creating a consistent symbolic language that reinforced the theological importance of the royal family's marriage practices. The starry ceilings of the palace chambers where these ceremonies took place were decorated with astronomical scenes that connected the earthly marriages to the cosmic order. The movement of the stars and planets was understood to reflect and influence the relationships among the gods, and by extension, the marriages of their earthly representatives. Palace astronomer priests carefully calculated the most auspicious times for wedding ceremonies, ensuring that each union took place when the celestial omens were most favorable. The prosperity that characterized Amenhotep III's reign was partly attributed to the divine favor that these marriages were believed to generate. The Nile's annual flood, the success of military campaigns, and the flow of tribute from subject peoples were all seen as evidence that the gods approved of the pharaoh's family arrangements. This theological framework provided powerful motivation for maintaining and expanding the practice of royal sibling marriage. The educational system that prepared royal children for these eventual marriages was itself a sophisticated institution that combined practical training in governance with religious instruction in the cosmic significance of their future roles. Young princes and princesses learned to understand their personal relationships as aspects of their service to the state and the gods, a perspective that helped them navigate the complex emotional and political challenges that these arrangements inevitably created. The legacy of Amenhotep III's approach to royal marriage would influence Egyptian practice for centuries, establishing patterns that would be followed by his successors even as the political and religious landscape of the ancient world underwent dramatic changes. The careful balance he had achieved between personal relationships and state policy became a model for how royal families could use marriage to reinforce their authority while maintaining the divine legitimacy that Egyptian kingship required. The memory of this golden age would be preserved in the monuments and artistic works that celebrated these royal unions, serving as inspiration for later rulers who sought to recapture the prosperity and stability that had characterized Egypt during its period of greatest power. The tradition of royal sibling marriage had reached its most sophisticated expression during Amenhotep III's reign, creating a legacy that would endure long after the political circumstances that had made it possible had passed into history. Cambyses. 2. ATOSSA. The mountain breezes of Pasargadae carried the scent of almond blossoms through the terraced gardens where Cambyses II walked with his sister ATOSSA, their conversations punctuated by the gentle sound of water flowing through the sophisticated irrigation channels that made the Persian heartland bloom even in the arid climate of the Iranian plateau. The Achaemenid court had embraced the practice of royal sibling marriage as part of their claim to divine legitimacy, drawing on ancient Indo-Iranian traditions that celebrated the cosmic significance of unions within the royal bloodline. The springtime ceremonies that marked their marriage took place against the backdrop of the greatest empire the world had yet seen, stretching from the Indus Valley to the shores of the Aegean Sea. Cambyses II, heir to Cyrus the Great's unprecedented conquests, understood that his marriage to ATOSSA was not merely a personal arrangement, but a statement about the divine nature of Achaemenid rule. The Persian court had adopted and adapted the royal customs of the peoples they had conquered, creating a synthesis of traditions that legitimized their authority over dozens of different cultures. The royal edict that announced their marriage was carefully crafted to cite ancient precedents that would resonate with Persian nobles who valued tradition above innovation. Palace scribes had researched the genealogies of legendary kings, finding examples of divine siblings whose marriages had established cosmic order and ensured the prosperity of their subjects. These historical precedents, whether real or mythical, provided the theological framework that transformed what might otherwise have been seen as a controversial decision into an affirmation of time-honored custom. ATOSSA possessed an intelligence and political acumen that would make her one of the most influential women in Persian history, though during her marriage to Cambyses II, she was still developing the skills that would later make her indispensable to the Achaemenid dynasty. Palace observers noted her careful attention to the complex protocols that governed court life, her facility with the multiple languages spoken throughout the empire, and her intuitive understanding of the delicate balance of interests that held the vast Persian territories together. Their evening conversations, conducted in the palace apartments that overlooked the tomb of Cyrus the Great, ranged across the philosophical and practical challenges of governing an empire that encompassed virtually every known civilization. ATOSSA's questions often focused on the administrative innovations that would be necessary to maintain Persian control over such diverse populations, while Cambyses II was more interested in the military strategies that would be required to defend their vast frontiers against external threats. The tea-scented atmosphere of these intimate discussions provided a sharp contrast to the formal ceremonies that dominated public court life. The Persian nobility expected their rulers to maintain the dignified reserve that befitted their semi-divine status, but in private moments, Cambyses II and ATOSSA could explore ideas and emotions that would have been inappropriate in more public settings. These conversations often continued late into the night, with the royal couple working through the complex implications of the decisions that would shape the future of their empire. The healing myths that surrounded their marriage were carefully constructed by court poets and historians who understood the importance of providing theological justification for royal practices that might otherwise seem strange to foreign subjects. These stories drew parallels between the royal couple and the divine siblings of ancient Persian mythology, creating a narrative framework that made their union appear not only appropriate, but cosmically necessary for the continued prosperity of the empire. The fireside storytellers who entertained the court during the long mountain winters became important custodians of these legitimizing narratives. Their tales, told to audiences that often included foreign ambassadors and provincial governors, served multiple purposes. They entertained the court, reinforced Persian religious beliefs, and provided diplomatic messages about the divine nature of Achaemenid authority. The sleepy courtiers who listened to these stories carried them back to their home provinces, spreading the theological framework that supported royal sibling marriage throughout the empire. ATOSSA's role in the Zoroastrian religious ceremonies that were central to Persian court life demonstrated her understanding of the cosmic significance that Achaemenid ideology attached to the royal family. Her participation in the fire rituals that maintained the sacred flames was marked by a dignity and reverence that impressed even the most conservative priests. These public demonstrations of piety served to reinforce the legitimacy of her marriage while positioning her as a guardian of Persian religious tradition. The later reverence for ATOSSA as the matriarch of future kings reflected the success of her marriage to Cambyses II in establishing her position within the Achaemenid dynasty. Though the marriage would end with Cambyses II's death during his Egyptian campaign, ATOSSA's subsequent marriage to Darius would make her the mother of Xerxes and one of the most powerful women in the ancient world. The foundation for this later influence was laid during her first marriage, as she learned to navigate the complexities of Persian court politics. The diplomatic dimensions of their marriage became apparent in the careful attention that foreign rulers paid to the theological implications of Achaemenid family arrangements. The Persian practice of royal sibling marriage required other kingdoms to acknowledge the special status that the Achaemenids claimed for themselves. creating a hierarchy of legitimacy that reinforced Persian diplomatic superiority. Foreign ambassadors learned to speak respectfully of these arrangements, understanding that criticism of Persian royal customs could jeopardize their missions. The architectural settings for their wedding ceremonies reflected the Persian genius for combining the artistic traditions of their subject peoples into a coherent imperial style. The palace at Persepolis, still under construction during their marriage, would eventually feature relief carvings that depicted royal couples in poses that emphasized their divine nature and cosmic significance. These artistic programs served as permanent reminders of the theological principles that justified Achaemenid rule. The administrative innovations that characterized Cambyses II's reign were often developed through his discussions with ATOSSA, whose understanding of cultural differences throughout the empire proved invaluable in creating policies that could be implemented effectively across diverse populations. Her insights into the religious beliefs and social customs of the various peoples under Persian rule helped shape administrative practices that maintained imperial unity while respecting local traditions. The memory of their marriage would be preserved in the Zoroastrian texts that recorded the genealogies and achievements of Achaemenid rulers, serving as precedent for later royal unions and providing theological justification for the dynasty's claims to divine legitimacy. The tradition they helped establish would influence Persian royal practice for centuries, creating a model that would be adopted by later Iranian dynasties and leaving a lasting impact on the political culture of the Iranian plateau. XWÄDŌDAH in Sasanian Iran, ARDASHIR I, DENAG. The dawn mist rose slowly from the Tigris River as it wound past the vaulted halls of Ctesiphon, where Ardashir I and his sister DENAG prepared for the morning rituals that would mark another day in the restoration of Persian greatness. The incense spiraled upward through the elaborate architectural spaces that the first Sasanian king had commissioned to rival the greatest monuments of the ancient world, while the soft chanting of Zoroastrian priests provided a musical backdrop to the emergence of a dynasty that would rule Iran for over 4 centuries. The practice of XWÄDŌDAH, the sacred marriage between close relatives that was central to Zoroastrian theology, had found its most sophisticated expression in the Sasanian court. Ardashir, I understood that his marriage to DENAG was not merely a political arrangement, but a religious obligation that demonstrated his commitment to the cosmic order that Zoroastrian doctrine described. The priest-philosophers who advised the royal couple explained that such unions served to purify the divine essence that flowed through the royal bloodline, concentrating the sacred fire that enabled proper rule. The palace theologians who developed the intellectual framework for these marriages drew on centuries of Zoroastrian scholarship to create a comprehensive doctrine that explained the cosmic significance of VII'S. Their treatises, copied by scribes working in the scriptorium that adjoined the royal apartments, described how the marriage of siblings replicated the primordial union that had created the world. According to this theological system, the royal couple's union served to maintain the cosmic balance between light and darkness that was essential for the continued existence of creation itself. DENAG brought to her marriage not only the bloodline that legitimized Ardashir's claim to the Persian throne, but also the intelligence and cultural sophistication that would help establish the Sasanian court as a center of learning and artistic achievement. Her daily routines included oversight of the manuscript copying workshops, where scholars preserved and transmitted the Zoroastrian texts that provided the intellectual foundation for Sasanian rule. The quiet concentration of these scholarly spaces provided a striking contrast to the more public areas of the palace where diplomatic and military affairs dominated the conversation. The garden strolls that the royal couple took among the date palms and pomegranate trees of the palace grounds served multiple purposes beyond mere recreation. These walks provided opportunities for private conversations about policy matters that required careful consideration, while also demonstrating to court observers the harmony that characterized their marriage. The sight of the king and queen walking together through the carefully maintained landscapes became a symbol of the order and prosperity that Sasanian rule had brought to the Iranian plateau. The serene atmosphere that characterized these garden conversations reflected the confidence that Ardashir and DENAG felt about their dynasty's future. Unlike the Parthian rulers they had displaced, the Sasanians possessed a clear ideological framework that justified their authority and provided guidance for both domestic and foreign policy. The Zoroastrian principles that governed their marriage also shaped their approach to governance, creating a consistency between private life and public policy that strengthened their position among both Persian nobles and subject populations. DENAG's patronage of embroidery workshops for orphaned girls demonstrated the social responsibilities that Sasanian royal women were expected to assume. These workshops, scattered throughout the palace complex, provided both practical skills training and moral education for young women who might otherwise have been left destitute by the warfare that had marked the transition from Parthian to Sasanian rule. The gentle clicking of needles and the soft conversations that filled these spaces created an atmosphere of purposeful activity that reflected the Queen's commitment to social welfare. The sunset rituals that the royal couple performed beside the Tigris River became one of the most distinctive features of early Sasanian court life. As the day ended, Ardashir and DENAG would make their way to the specially constructed platform that overlooked the water, where they would participate in the evening prayers that maintained the sacred fires burning throughout the empire. The chants that accompanied these ceremonies gradually faded into the night sounds of the river, creating a seamless transition between human worship and the natural rhythms of the world. The theological significance of these evening rituals extended far beyond their immediate religious purposes. The sight of the royal couple participating together in these ceremonies reinforced the legitimacy of their marriage while demonstrating their commitment to the Zoroastrian principles that governed Sasanian rule. Foreign ambassadors who witnessed these rituals understood that they were observing not merely personal devotions, but state ceremonies that expressed the fundamental beliefs of the Persian court. The administrative innovations that characterized Ardashir's reign often emerged from his discussions with DENAG, whose understanding of Zoroastrian law provided important guidance for the development of legal codes that would govern the empire. The Sasanian legal system that emerged during their reign successfully balanced the demands of imperial administration with the requirements of religious law, creating a framework that could accommodate the diverse populations under Persian rule while maintaining the ideological coherence that distinguished Sasanian governance from earlier Iranian dynasties. The palace workshops where skilled artisans created the objects that symbolized Sasanian royal authority reflected the cultural renaissance that accompanied the political restoration that Ardashir had achieved. The silver plates, textiles, and jewelry produced in these workshops often featured symbolic representations of royal sibling marriage, creating a visual vocabulary that reinforced the theological principles underlying Sasanian rule. These artistic productions were distributed throughout the empire as diplomatic gifts, spreading awareness of Sasanian ideology to neighboring kingdoms. The intellectual atmosphere of the Sasanian court during Ardashir I and DENAG's reign attracted scholars and artists from throughout the known world, creating a cosmopolitan environment that rivaled the great cultural centers of antiquity. The marriage of the royal siblings served as a focal point for this cultural flowering, providing both inspiration and patronage for artistic and intellectual achievements that would influence Iranian civilization for centuries. The military successes that marked Ardashir's reign were often attributed to the divine favor that his marriage to DENAG was believed to generate. The Zoroastrian priests who accompanied Sasanian armies carried sacred fires that were understood to derive their power partly from the purity of the royal bloodline, creating a direct connection between the king's personal relationships and the military effectiveness of his forces. The legacy of Ardashir I and DENAG's marriage extended far beyond their own lifetimes, establishing precedents that would influence Sasanian royal practice for the entire duration of the dynasty. Their successful synthesis of religious obligation and political necessity created a model that later rulers could follow, providing both practical guidance and theological justification for the continuation of XWÄDŌDAH as a cornerstone of Sasanian royal ideology. HUAYNA CÁPAC, RAHUA OCLLO. The thin mountain air of Cusco carried the haunting melodies of bamboo flutes across the terraced slopes where HUAYNA CÁPAC and his sister RAHUA OCLLO ruled over the greatest empire the Americas had ever known. The Inca capital nestled in its high valley like a jewel set in stone, its precisely fitted walls and golden temples reflecting the divine order that governed Tawantinsuyu, the realm of the four directions. Their sibling marriage represented not merely a political alliance but a sacred union that reinforced their divine descent from Inti, the Sun Father whose golden light blessed the Andean peaks each dawn. The palace quarters where the royal couple resided were lined with sheets of beaten gold that caught and reflected the mountain light, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that reminded all who entered of the divine nature of Inca rule. RAHUA OCLLO moved through these golden corridors with the measured grace of someone who understood that every gesture carried cosmic significance. Her elaborate feathered headdresses and jeweled ornaments, marking her status as both sister and wife to the Sapa Inca, the unique ruler whose authority extended from the steaming jungles of the Amazon to the coastal deserts of the Pacific. The alpaca wool tapestries that warmed the royal apartments during the cold mountain nights depicted the mythical origins of the Inca dynasty, showing how the first royal siblings had emerged from the sacred cave at Paccaritambo to establish Cusco as the center of the world. These textile narratives served both as decoration and as constant reminders of the divine mandate that justified the continuation of sibling marriage among the royal family. The intricate patterns and vibrant colors created a visual environment that reinforced the theological principles underlying Inca royal practice. HUAYNA CÁPAC's reign marked the zenith of Inca power, with tribute flowing into Cusco from provinces that stretched across the breadth of South America. The royal couple's daily routines included the oversight of this vast administrative system as llama caravans arrived with goods from the four quarters of the empire. RAHUA OCLLO took particular interest in the textiles that arrived from different provinces, using her expertise in weaving to evaluate the quality of tribute cloth and to identify regional variations in artistic techniques. The processions that marked the major festivals of the Inca calendar provided spectacular demonstrations of the wealth and power that HUAYNA CÁPAC and RAHUA OCLLO commanded. At dusk, when the mountain peaks glowed red in the setting sun, the royal couple would appear on the golden platform that overlooked the great square of Cusco, their silver goblets catching the last light as they poured chicha corn beer into the sacred channels that carried libations to the Earth Mother. The slow-paced chants that accompanied these ceremonies echoed off the stone walls of the surrounding temples, while the calming drumbeats created a rhythm that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the empire itself. The agricultural terraces that climbed the steep slopes around Cusco bore witness to the engineering genius of the Inca civilization, and the royal couple often made ceremonial visits to these mountain farms to participate in the planting and harvest rituals that ensured the empire's prosperity. These occasions allowed HUAYNA CÁPAC and RAHUA OCLLO to demonstrate their connection to the common people, while reinforcing the cosmic significance of their union. The sight of the divine rulers working alongside their subjects created powerful bonds of loyalty that helped maintain social stability throughout the empire. The religious ceremonies that celebrated their marriage drew on centuries of Andean tradition, combining elements from the various cultures that the Incas had incorporated into their empire. The sacred calendar was punctuated by festivals that honored different aspects of their divine union, from the ceremonies that celebrated their roles as earthly representatives of the sun and moon, to the rituals that emphasized their function as intermediaries between the human and divine realms. These celebrations often lasted for days, with the entire population of Cusco participating in dances and feasts that reinforced the social bonds that held the empire together. The administrative system that governed the Inca Empire required constant attention from both rulers, as reports arrived daily from the provincial governors who managed the far-flung territories of Tawantinsuyu. Rahua OCLLO proved particularly skilled at interpreting the quipu, the knotted string records that served as the Inca writing system, and she often worked late into the evening by the light of oil lamps, translating these complex documents for her husband's review. Their collaborative approach to governance helped ensure that the empire's administrative machinery continued to function smoothly, despite the enormous distances and geographical challenges involved. The palace workshops where skilled artisans created the objects that symbolized Inca royal authority reflected the cultural diversity of the empire. As craftsmen from different regions brought their traditional techniques to Cusco, the gold and silver work that adorned the royal couple was often combined with feathers from Amazonian birds, shells from the Pacific coast, and precious stones from the eastern slopes of the Andes. These composite artistic traditions created a visual language that expressed the unity of the empire while acknowledging the contributions of its diverse populations. The educational system that prepared royal children for their eventual roles as rulers included intensive training in the astronomical knowledge that was essential for proper governance. HUAYNA, CÁPAC, and RAHUA OCLLO often spent their evenings on the palace terraces, studying the movement of stars and planets that guided the agricultural calendar and determined the timing of religious festivals. These astronomical observations were understood to provide direct communication with the divine realm, making the royal couple's knowledge of celestial movements an essential aspect of their legitimacy. The diplomatic relations that the Inca Empire maintained with neighboring peoples often centered on the recognition of the divine nature of the royal sibling marriage. Foreign ambassadors who visited Cusco were required to acknowledge the cosmic significance of HUAYNA CÁPAC and RAHUA OCLLO's union, understanding that this recognition implied acceptance of Inca claims to universal authority. The careful protocol that governed these diplomatic encounters reflected the Inca understanding that their empire represented not merely a political entity, but a divinely ordained cosmic order. The military campaigns that extended Inca authority into new territories were often justified by reference to the divine mandate that the royal couple's marriage was believed to represent. The armies that carried Inca authority to the furthest reaches of South America bore standards that depicted the sun and moon symbols associated with the royal siblings, creating visible links between military conquest and cosmic order. These symbolic connections helped legitimize Inca expansion while providing theological justification for the incorporation of new populations into the empire. Yet beneath the serene surface of HUAYNA CÁPAC's reign, seeds of future civil war were already beginning to germinate. The emperor's decision to divide the empire between his sons, rather than following the traditional pattern of undivided inheritance, created the conditions for the devastating conflict that would ultimately facilitate Spanish conquest. The murmuring discontent that began to surface in the distant provinces suggested that the divine harmony symbolized by the royal marriage was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain in practice. The legacy of HUAYNA CÁPAC and RAHUA OCLLO's reign would be preserved in the oral traditions of the Andean peoples, who continued to sing of the golden age when brother and sister had ruled in perfect harmony from their mountain capital. Their marriage represented the culmination of Inca royal tradition, a synthesis of political necessity and religious obligation that had enabled the creation of the largest empire in pre-Columbian America. HUÁSCAR, CHUQUI. The candlelit chambers of Coricancha, the golden temple that formed the spiritual heart of Cusco, witnessed the coronation of HUÁSCAR and his sister CHUQUI as the final Inca rulers to govern a united empire. The ceremony took place amid the accumulated splendor of centuries, with sheets of gold covering every surface and the mummified remains of previous Inca rulers seated on their golden thrones as witnesses to this latest chapter in the divine dynasty. Yet even as the priests performed the ancient rituals that had consecrated so many royal couples before them, the shadows of civil war were already lengthening across the Andean peaks. The young royal couple had inherited an empire at the moment of its greatest territorial extent and its deepest internal divisions. HUÁSCAR, named for the golden chain that had measured his birth weight, possessed the legitimate claim to undivided rule that tradition demanded, while his sister wife CHUQUI HUIPA brought to their marriage the pure bloodline that reinforced their divine status. Their gentle routines of maize offerings and starlit astronomy lessons provided a stark contrast to the military preparations that increasingly dominated life in the Inca capital. The astronomy lessons that filled their evening hours took on special significance as the royal couple sought divine guidance for the challenges that faced their reign. From the stone platforms that overlooked Cusco's valley, HUÁSCAR and CHUQUI HUIPA would study the movement of the Southern Cross and other constellations that governed the Inca calendar, searching for signs that might indicate the gods' will regarding the growing threat posed by Atahualpa's northern armies. The soft glow of the Milky Way, which the Incas called the River of Stars, provided a celestial backdrop for conversations that grew increasingly urgent as reports arrived of military movements in the distant provinces. The administrative burden of governing an empire that stretched across the entire western coast of South America required constant attention from both rulers, but the traditional systems that had served previous generations were beginning to strain under the pressure of divided loyalties and competing claims. CHUQUI HUIPA proved particularly skilled at interpreting the complex reports that arrived via the CHUQUI messenger system. Her understanding of the various languages spoken throughout the empire, enabling her to detect subtle nuances in the communications from provincial governors. The palace workshops that had once produced objects celebrating the harmony of Inca rule now worked feverishly to create weapons and military equipment for the armies that both brothers were assembling. The gold and silver ornaments that had adorned religious ceremonies were melted down to fund military campaigns, while the skilled artisans, who had once focused on creating beautiful objects, found themselves pressed into service, supporting the war effort. The transformation of these creative spaces into military production centers symbolized the broader changes that were overtaking Inca society. The religious festivals that had traditionally reinforced the cosmic order, represented by royal sibling marriage, took on a desperate quality as HUÁSCAR and CHUQUI HUIPA sought to demonstrate their divine legitimacy in the face of Atahualpa's challenge. The ceremonies in Coricancha became elaborate productions designed to remind the people of Cusco that their rulers possessed the sacred authority that came from proper descent and legitimate marriage. The priests who conducted these rituals understood that they were not merely performing religious observances, but engaging in a propaganda war for the hearts and minds of the Inca people. The quiet tension that pervaded the palace reflected the impossible position in which the royal couple found themselves. While they maintained the public ceremonies that tradition demanded, their private conversations increasingly focused on military strategy and diplomatic options. CHUQUI HUIPA's insights into the loyalties of different provincial leaders proved invaluable as HUÁSCAR attempted to build coalitions that could resist his brother's advancing forces, but the geographical advantages that Atahualpa enjoyed made the outcome of their conflict increasingly predictable. The traditional marriage customs that had once provided stability for the Inca dynasty now seemed almost irrelevant in the face of the existential crisis that confronted the empire. The theological arguments that supported sibling marriage carried little weight with armies that were motivated more by personal loyalty to charismatic commanders than by abstract principles of divine legitimacy. The carefully maintained balance between religious tradition and political pragmatism that had characterized earlier reigns was breaking down under the pressure of civil war. The llama caravans that had once carried tribute from distant provinces to the capital now bore increasingly urgent messages about military movements and shifting allegiances. HUÁSCAR and CHUQUI HUIPA found themselves spending more time in war councils than in the religious ceremonies that had traditionally occupied much of a royal couple's attention. The maps spread across their planning tables showed an empire that was rapidly fragmenting along regional lines, with provincial governors calculating their chances of survival under different scenarios. The cultural traditions that had unified the diverse populations of the Inca Empire began to fracture as the civil war progressed, with different regions invoking local customs to justify their choice of sides in the conflict. The royal couple's attempts to maintain imperial unity through appeals to shared religious beliefs became increasingly ineffective as practical considerations of survival took precedence over ideological loyalty. The empire that had been built on the foundation of divine royal marriage was discovering the limits of religious authority in the face of military force. The siege mentality that gradually developed in Cusco transformed the royal capital into an armed camp, with fortifications rising around the temples and palaces that had once stood open to all the empire's subjects. HUÁSCAR and CHUQUI found themselves virtual prisoners in their own palace, dependent on the loyalty of guards whose reliability became increasingly questionable as news of Atahualpa's victories reached the capital. The golden halls that had once echoed with celebration now resonated with the hushed conversations of conspirators and the nervous footsteps of sentries. The final defeat, when it came, was swift and brutal. The royal couple who had been portrayed as the earthly representatives of the sun and moon found themselves reduced to captives in a conflict that had stripped away the mystical aura that had protected their dynasty for centuries. The sibling marriage that was supposed to provide the ultimate legitimacy for Inca rule proved powerless against the harsh realities of military conquest and political calculation. The soft downfall that marked the end of HUÁSCAR and CHUQUI's reign took place in the torch-lit chambers where they were held prisoner. Their whispered farewells, marking not only the end of their personal partnership, but the collapse of the political and religious system that had created the greatest empire in pre-Columbian America. Their deaths removed the last obstacle to Atahualpa's claim to undivided rule, but they also eliminated the unifying symbol that might have enabled effective resistance to the Spanish invasion that was already approaching the Inca heartland. The memory of their brief reign would be preserved in the oral traditions of the Andean peoples, who remembered them as the last rulers to embody the full dignity and sacred authority of the Inca tradition. Their marriage had represented the final flowering of a royal custom that had provided both legitimacy and stability for the Inca dynasty, but which proved inadequate to the unprecedented challenges of civil war and foreign invasion. Atahualpa, CUXIRIMAY, OCLLO. The steamy thermal baths of Cajamarca provided a tranquil refuge where Atahualpa and his young sister-wife CUXIRIMAY OCLLO could perform their morning ablutions in water heated by the volcanic forces that shaped the Andean landscape. The rising vapors created an ethereal atmosphere that seemed to separate them from the harsh realities of the world beyond the bath chambers, where Spanish conquistadors were already making their way through the mountain passes toward the Inca heartland. Their muted Quechua prayers for unity drifted through the steam like whispered hopes for a future that was already slipping beyond their control. CUXIRIMAY OCLLO possessed the serene dignity that had characterized the greatest queens of the Inca dynasty, her calm poise providing a striking contrast to the increasingly desperate circumstances that surrounded their reign. Though barely out of adolescence, she carried herself with the consciousness of someone who understood that her marriage to Atahualpa represented not merely a personal union but the last hope for maintaining the divine legitimacy that had sustained Inca rule for centuries. Her gentle movements through the palace corridors brought a sense of grace to an environment that was increasingly dominated by the urgent preparations for an unprecedented military and diplomatic challenge. The Spanish-surrounded camp that Cajamarca had become transformed the traditional rhythms of Inca royal life into something resembling a diplomatic siege. Atahualpa and CUXIRIMAY OCLLO found themselves entertaining foreign visitors whose intentions remained unclear, their palace suddenly filled with bearded men in metal armor who spoke a language that sounded harsh to ears accustomed to the flowing syllables of Quechua. The royal couple's attempts to maintain the ceremonial protocols that tradition demanded were complicated by the need to navigate cultural differences that neither side fully understood. Their moonlit conversations on the palace terraces overlooking the valley took on special poignancy as the royal couple discussed the omens and portents that seemed to multiply with each passing day. The appearance of the Spanish had been accompanied by a series of unusual celestial events that the Inca astronomers struggled to interpret, while reports from distant provinces spoke of strange diseases and supernatural phenomena that suggested the cosmic order itself was under threat. These intimate discussions were punctuated by the distant sounds of Spanish muskets being tested, a harsh counterpoint to the traditional flute music that had once provided the soundtrack to royal evening conversations. The symbolism of their marriage took on desperate importance as Atahualpa sought to demonstrate his legitimacy to both his own subjects and the foreign invaders who claimed to represent a distant emperor. The union with his sister was presented as evidence of his divine mandate to rule, a theological argument that carried weight with Inca subjects but seemed to confuse and disturb the Spanish missionaries who accompanied the conquistadors. The cultural chasm between Andean and European concepts of legitimate authority became most apparent in discussions of royal marriage practices. The palace ceremonies that celebrated their union were adapted to accommodate the presence of Spanish observers, creating awkward hybrid events that satisfied neither Inca religious requirements nor European diplomatic expectations. CUXIRIMAY OCLLO's role in these modified rituals required her to serve as both queen and cultural interpreter, explaining Inca customs to foreigners while maintaining the sacred dignity that her position demanded. The strain of these performances was evident in the careful control she maintained over her expressions and gestures. The traditional Inca administrative system continued to function around the royal couple even as the Spanish presence grew more dominant in the region. Messages continued to arrive via the CHUQUI runner system, bringing news from provinces that remained under Inca control and requests for guidance from governors who struggled to understand the implications of the Spanish arrival. Atahualpa and CUXIRIMAY OCLLO spent increasing amounts of time reviewing these communications, searching for strategies that might preserve some remnant of Inca independence. The cultural treasures that had been assembled in Cajamarca for Atahualpa's coronation as undisputed Inca ruler became the focus of Spanish attention, as the conquistadors marveled at the quantity of gold and silver that filled the royal storehouses. CUXIRIMAY OCLLO watched with quiet dignity as objects that held deep religious significance for her people were evaluated solely for their material worth, understanding that this fundamental difference in values symbolized the broader incompatibility between the two civilizations. The negotiation sessions that attempted to establish some framework for coexistence between Inca and Spanish authority revealed the impossibility of bridging the cultural gap that separated the two sides. Atahualpa's attempts to maintain his status as a divine ruler, while acknowledging Spanish claims to overlordship, created logical contradictions that no amount of diplomatic skill could resolve. CUXIRIMAY OCLLO's presence at these meetings served to remind all participants of the cosmic significance that Inca theology attached to royal marriage. But these religious arguments carried no weight with men whose primary interest lay in material conquest. The evening church bells that the Spanish began to ring in Cajamarca provided a jarring contrast to the traditional Inca ritual schedule, their metallic clanging drowning out the softer sounds of indigenous ceremonies. The royal couple's attempts to maintain their religious observances while accommodating Spanish demands for Christian conversion created an impossible tension that highlighted the irreconcilable differences between the two systems of belief. The final confrontation, when it came, swept away all pretense of diplomatic accommodation. The capture of Atahualpa during the infamous meeting in Cajamarca's central plaza left CUXIRIMAY OCLLO in the impossible position of maintaining royal dignity while her husband was held prisoner by foreign invaders. Her behavior during this crisis demonstrated the courage and composure that had characterized the greatest figures in Inca history. but it also revealed the powerlessness of traditional authority in the face of European military technology and political ruthlessness. The quiet exile that followed the destruction of Inca independence carried the royal couple far from the mountain palaces where their ancestors had ruled for centuries. Their conversations during this period, conducted under Spanish guard and subject to constant surveillance, focused on preserving what remained of Inca cultural traditions for future generations. The memories of Andean constellations that had once guided their empire's agricultural calendar became treasured fragments of a world that no longer existed. The aftermath of the conquest left CUQIRIMAY OCLLO as one of the last living links to the golden age of Inca civilization, her presence serving as a reminder of the sophisticated culture that the Spanish had destroyed. Her dignity in defeat became legendary among the native populations of the Andes, who saw in her bearing a model for how to maintain cultural identity under foreign domination. The sibling marriage that had once symbolized cosmic harmony became a memory of independence that sustained indigenous resistance for generations. The legacy of ATAHUALPA and CUQIRIMAY OCLLO's brief reign lay not in any political achievements, but in their embodiment of Inca royal tradition during its final flowering. Their marriage represented the culmination of centuries of Andean political and religious development, a synthesis of practical governance and cosmic symbolism that had enabled the creation of South America's greatest empire. The Spanish conquest that ended their reign also marked the end of a unique form of royal marriage that had played a central role in pre-Columbian American civilization. KEAWEʻÍKEKAHIALIʻIOKAMOKU, Kalani Kaulele Iwi. The rolling surf of Hawaii Island whispered against the black volcanic shores as KEAWEʻÍKEKAHIALIʻIOKAMOKU and his sister, Kalani Kaulele Iwi, walked the pandanus-scented beaches where their ancestors had first established the bromand, sacred chieftainship that governed the island kingdom. The trade winds carried the fragrance of plumeria and male through the coconut groves that surrounded their royal compound, while the distant sound of traditional drums echoed across the water from neighboring islands, where allied chiefs acknowledged their supremacy. Their Niaupio marriage represented the highest form of sacred union in Polynesian society, designed to produce children of such exalted rank that they would be revered as living manifestations of divine authority. The concept of sacred bones that governed Hawaiian royal marriage reflected a sophisticated understanding of spiritual hierarchy that had developed over centuries of Polynesian navigation and settlement. Kalani Kaulele Iwi possessed the highest possible rank through her pure descent from the ancient chiefs who had ruled the islands since the legendary migrations from distant Tahiti, while her brother's lineage carried equally prestigious connections to the divine ancestors whose spirits continued to guide their descendants. Their union was understood to concentrate these spiritual essences in their offspring, creating rulers whose authority would be unquestionable. The peaceful Kailua Heiau ceremonies that marked the major festivals of the Hawaiian calendar provided the setting for the most elaborate celebrations of their marriage. The temple platforms, constructed from carefully fitted lava stones and decorated with key leaves and white kapa cloth, served as sacred stages where the royal couple participated in rituals that maintained the cosmic balance between the earthly and divine realms. The flickering light of coconut oil lamps created dancing shadows on the carved wooden images of the gods, while the soft chanting of kahuna priests provided a musical backdrop to ceremonies that could last for days. Their daily canoe outings on the glass-still bays that indented the island's coastline offered opportunities for both recreation and the sacred responsibilities that their rank demanded. The royal couple would often paddle to offshore fishing grounds where they performed the blessing ceremonies that ensured abundant catches for their subjects, or visit sea turtle nesting beaches where they conducted the rituals that protected these sacred creatures. The gentle rhythm of their paddles cutting through the calm water provided a meditative backdrop for conversations about the spiritual and practical challenges of ruling their island kingdom. The sea turtle sightings that frequently marked these maritime expeditions were interpreted as favorable omens that confirmed the gods' approval of their marriage. Hawaiian tradition regarded these ancient creatures as aumakua, ancestral spirits that had taken animal form to guide and protect their descendants. The sight of these graceful beings gliding through the crystal-clear waters was understood to indicate that the royal couple's union enjoyed divine blessing, a theological confirmation that reinforced their authority among subjects who looked to natural signs for guidance about their ruler's legitimacy. The legacy of calm governance that characterized their reign became the subject of lullabies chanted at sunset throughout the Hawaiian Islands, as mothers sang their children to sleep with stories of the wise chiefs who had ruled with justice and compassion. These musical traditions preserved the memory of specific policies and decisions that had brought prosperity to the islands, while also transmitting the cultural values that had enabled Hawaiian society to flourish in the isolation of the Pacific. The gentle melodies that carried these stories from generation to generation created a cultural continuity that survived even the dramatic changes that would later transform Hawaiian society. The administrative system that governed the Hawaiian Islands under their rule reflected the sophisticated political organization that had evolved from centuries of Polynesian chiefly tradition. The Ahupua land divisions that stretched from mountain peaks to coral reefs provided both economic resources and the framework for local governance, while the complex network of relationships between chiefs of different ranks created a stable hierarchy that could accommodate both cooperation and competition. Kalaniʻōleliʻi's understanding of these traditional systems proved invaluable in maintaining the delicate balance of interests that kept their kingdom peaceful. The religious ceremonies that sanctified their marriage drew on the deepest traditions of Polynesian spirituality, connecting their personal union to the cosmic forces that governed the movement of stars, the rhythm of tides, and the fertility of the land. The kahuna priests who conducted these rituals possessed encyclopedic knowledge of the genealogies that linked every Hawaiian family to the gods, enabling them to explain the theological significance of royal sibling marriage in terms that resonated with subjects who understood their own identities in genealogical terms. The artistic traditions that flourished during their reign reflected the prosperity and stability that their rule had brought to the islands. The kapa cloth produced by Hawaiian women reached new levels of sophistication, with designs that incorporated symbolic representations of their royal marriage and the divine harmony it was believed to represent. The feathered regalia worn by the royal couple during ceremonial occasions required the labor of skilled craftsmen who gathered materials from throughout the Pacific, creating objects that demonstrated both Hawaiian artistic achievement and the extensive trade networks that connected the islands to other Polynesian societies. The oral traditions that preserved the history of their reign emphasized the peaceful nature of their rule and their attention to the welfare of common people. Stories told in chiefly courts throughout Polynesia described specific instances of their generosity and wisdom, creating a reputation that enhanced Hawaiian prestige throughout the Pacific world. These narrative traditions also provided models for proper, chiefly behavior that influenced rulers in other island kingdoms, spreading Hawaiian political and cultural innovations across vast oceanic distances. The agricultural innovations that characterized their reign demonstrated the practical benefits that could flow from the spiritual harmony that their marriage was believed to represent. The terraced taro fields that climbed the volcanic slopes of their island kingdom reached new levels of productivity, while the fish pond systems that dotted the coastline provided reliable sources of protein for a growing population. These technological achievements were understood to result from the divine favor that their union had secured, creating a direct connection between personal relationships and public prosperity. The diplomatic relations that the Hawaiian kingdom maintained with other Polynesian societies often centered on recognition of the exalted rank that their marriage represented. Chiefs from distant island groups would travel thousands of miles across open ocean to pay homage to rulers whose spiritual authority was acknowledged throughout the Pacific world. These ceremonial exchanges reinforced Hawaiian prestige while providing opportunities for cultural and technological exchange that benefited all participants. The educational system that prepared young Hawaiian nobles for their future responsibilities included detailed instruction in the genealogical knowledge that justified the practice of sibling marriage among the highest ranks. Students learned to recite the complex family histories that connected contemporary chiefs to the divine ancestors, understanding that this knowledge was essential for maintaining the spiritual authority that enabled effective rule. The memorization techniques developed for preserving these oral traditions created intellectual disciplines that served Hawaiian society in many different contexts. The legacy of KEAWEʻಈKEKAHIALIʻIOKAMOKU and Kalaniʻauleleʻi's reign would be preserved in the chanted genealogies that remained central to Hawaiian culture for centuries, serving as both historical records and spiritual guides for future generations. Their marriage had demonstrated the potential for sibling unions to create the kind of spiritual concentration that enabled effective leadership in Polynesian society, establishing precedents that would influence Hawaiian royal practice until the final overthrow of the indigenous monarchy in the 19th century. Kamehameha III, Koʻikeauli, Kamamalu. The early morning mist cloaked Honolulu's wooden palace verandas in a soft embrace as Kamehameha III, known by his birth name Kauikeaouli, and his sister Kamamalu navigated the delicate transition between the ancient Hawaiian traditions that had shaped their childhood and the rapidly changing world that Christian missionaries and Western traders were creating around them. The palace, constructed in a hybrid style that blended Polynesian architectural principles with European influences, served as both residence and symbol of a kingdom caught between two worlds, where royal siblings struggled to maintain their sacred authority while accommodating foreign demands for cultural transformation. Their childhood as twins had been marked by the special reverence that Hawaiian tradition accorded to such births, which were considered particularly auspicious for the royal lineage. The bond between brother and sister had been strengthened by their shared experience of growing up during the reign of their brother Kamehameha II, when the ancient kapu system that had governed Hawaiian society for centuries was formally abolished. This dramatic change had left them as among the last generation to be raised according to traditional protocols, while also preparing them for a future that would require unprecedented adaptations to foreign influences. The softly spoken political union that brought them together as rulers reflected the complex calculations that governed Hawaiian royal policy during this period of rapid change. Their marriage served traditional purposes in concentrating the sacred manner that legitimized chiefly authority, while also providing a framework for unified resistance to foreign pressures that threatened to fragment the kingdom. The ceremony itself was conducted according to ancient Hawaiian customs, but it took place in an environment where Christian missionaries watched with barely concealed disapproval, and Western merchants calculated the implications for their commercial interests. The quiet evenings when they learned hymn melodies from visiting missionaries provided a poignant illustration of the cultural transformation that was reshaping Hawaiian society. Kamamalu possessed a naturally musical voice that had been trained in the traditional chants that preserved Hawaiian history and genealogy, but she also showed remarkable aptitude for the European harmonies that the missionaries introduced as part of their campaign to replace indigenous religious practices with Christianity. These musical sessions became opportunities for the royal siblings to explore the possibilities for synthesizing their ancestral traditions with the new cultural influences that were rapidly becoming dominant. Their discreet affection, amid the slowly shifting Western norms, created a personal sanctuary within the broader transformation of Hawaiian society. While maintaining the public dignity that their royal status demanded, the siblings found ways to preserve the intimate bond that had characterized their relationship since childhood. Their private conversations often focused on strategies for protecting Hawaiian independence while accommodating foreign demands, with both understanding that their personal relationship had become a symbol of cultural continuity in a world where traditional authority was increasingly challenged. The palace life during their reign was marked by a constant stream of foreign visitors who brought both opportunities and threats to Hawaiian sovereignty. American merchants sought trading privileges that would give them preferential access to Hawaiian markets, while European diplomats pressed for territorial concessions that would advance their government's strategic interests in the Pacific. Kamehameha III and Kamamalu found themselves serving as cultural interpreters as much as political leaders, explaining Hawaiian customs to foreigners while learning to navigate the complex protocols of international diplomacy. The administrative challenges that faced their kingdom required careful balance between traditional Hawaiian governance systems and the bureaucratic innovations that foreign advisors insisted were necessary for modernization. The Ahupua, a land tenure system that had provided the foundation for Hawaiian society, was increasingly challenged by Western concepts of private property, while the complex network of chiefly relationships that had maintained social stability was strained by the introduction of written laws and formal courts. The royal couple worked together to find compromises that could preserve essential Hawaiian values while adapting to changing circumstances. The religious transformation that accompanied political and economic change created particularly difficult challenges for the royal siblings, whose traditional authority was intimately connected to Hawaiian spiritual beliefs that were being systematically suppressed by Christian missionaries. Their own conversion to Christianity was presented as voluntary, but it took place in circumstances where resistance would have jeopardized their political position and possibly Hawaiian independence itself. The private struggle to reconcile their new faith with their ancestral responsibilities created emotional tensions that few observers fully understood. The educational initiatives that characterized their reign reflected their understanding that Hawaiian survival in a changing world would depend on their people's ability to master new skills while preserving essential cultural values. Schools were established throughout the kingdom that taught both Hawaiian and English languages, while traditional knowledge systems were maintained alongside Western academic subjects. Kamamalu took particular interest in educational programs for Hawaiian women, understanding that cultural transmission would depend largely on mothers' ability to balance old and new influences. The diplomatic crises that periodically threatened Hawaiian independence required the royal couple to present a united front while pursuing strategies that often involved significant personal sacrifices. The pressure from American settlers for political privileges that would have reduced the kingdom to a protectorate was countered through careful cultivation of relationships with other foreign powers, creating a complex balancing act that required constant attention to shifting international alliances. Their marriage provided symbolic evidence of Hawaiian unity that strengthened their negotiating position in these crucial diplomatic encounters. The cultural renaissance that marked certain periods of their reign demonstrated the creative possibilities that could emerge from the synthesis of Hawaiian and foreign influences. The development of written Hawaiian literature, the adaptation of European musical forms to Hawaiian themes, and the creation of new artistic traditions that honored ancestral values, while incorporating foreign techniques, all reflected the kind of cultural innovation that their collaborative leadership encouraged. These achievements provided models for how traditional societies could adapt to foreign influence without losing their essential identity. The serene funeral voyage that marked the end of their partnership took place on waters that had been sacred to their ancestors for centuries, but the ceremony itself reflected the hybrid nature of Hawaiian culture that their reign had helped create. Traditional Hawaiian protocols were observed alongside Christian funeral rites, while the royal couple's legacy was celebrated in both ancient chants and newly composed hymns that would preserve their memory for future generations. The continuing echo of royal chants that accompanied their final journey served as a reminder of the cultural continuity they had helped maintain despite the enormous pressures for change that had characterized their era. The impact of their reign extended far beyond the immediate political and cultural achievements that marked their time in power. Their demonstration that traditional Hawaiian authority could adapt to foreign influence while maintaining its essential character provided a model that influenced indigenous leaders throughout the Pacific world. The strategies they developed for cultural preservation while accommodating necessary change became part of the legacy that sustained Hawaiian identity, even after the eventual loss of political independence. The personal dimension of their relationship, with its combination of genuine affection and political calculation, illustrated the human costs of leadership during periods of rapid cultural transformation. Their ability to maintain their bond while serving as symbols of cultural adaptation required constant emotional discipline and mutual support that few contemporary observers fully appreciated. The preservation of their story in Hawaiian oral tradition ensured that future generations would understand both the achievements and the sacrifices that had characterized their remarkable partnership. The institutional innovations that emerged during their reign, from the development of constitutional monarchy to the creation of modern educational systems, provided foundations for Hawaiian society that survived the eventual annexation by the United States. Their collaborative approach to governance demonstrated the effectiveness of shared leadership during times of crisis, while their personal relationship provided a model for how individuals could maintain cultural identity while adapting to changed circumstances. The memory of their reign became a source of inspiration for Hawaiian cultural revival movements that continued into the modern era. Ancient Cambodian Devata Queens, Jayavarman Zeros. Sister Bride. The saffron dawn light filtered through the stone corridors of Angkor Thom as Jayavarman VII and his sister queen moved through their morning rituals in the greatest temple complex the world had ever seen. The massive faces carved into the towers of the Bayon gazed serenely over the vast hydraulic city that represented the pinnacle of Khmer civilization, while the royal couple performed the ceremonies that maintained the cosmic order underlying their Buddhist kingdom. Their sister marriage served not merely as a political alliance, but as a living embodiment of the Mahayana compassion that governed their approach to rule, transforming the ancient Cambodian practice of royal sibling unions into a spiritual metaphor carved in stone. The stone reliefs that decorated the walls of their palace complex depicted royal couples in poses that emphasized the divine nature of their union, with intricate carvings showing brother and sister rulers participating in the religious ceremonies that maintained the kingdom's prosperity. These artistic programs served as both decoration and theological instruction, explaining to visitors the spiritual principles that justified sibling marriage, while demonstrating the cosmic significance that Khmer culture attached to these unions. The detailed craftsmanship of these reliefs reflected the sophisticated artistic traditions that had developed under royal patronage over several centuries. The shared dedication that characterized their approach to governance found its most concrete expression in the healing houses and forest monasteries that they established throughout their kingdom. These institutions reflected the Buddhist emphasis on compassion that had become central to Khmer royal ideology, providing medical care and spiritual guidance to subjects regardless of their social status. The Sister Queen's personal involvement in these charitable projects demonstrated her understanding that royal authority carried moral obligations that extended far beyond the ceremonial duties traditionally associated with monarchy. The quiet forest monasteries that dotted the Khmer kingdom provided refuges where Buddhist monks could pursue the contemplative practices that were essential to their spiritual development. The royal couple's support for these institutions reflected their commitment to the religious principles that governed their rule, while also serving practical political purposes by creating networks of loyalty among the Buddhist clergy, who played important roles in maintaining social stability. The peaceful atmosphere of these secluded communities provided a striking contrast to the elaborate ceremonies that marked life at the royal court. The evening incense that drifted over Angkor's wide moat created an ethereal atmosphere as the sun set behind the temple spires, while the sounds of frogs crooning in the distance provided a natural soundtrack to the daily rhythm of religious observance. The royal couple often participated in the evening ceremonies that marked the transition from day to night, their presence serving to connect the human and divine realms in the consciousness of their subjects. These daily rituals reinforced the legitimacy of their rule while providing opportunities for personal spiritual practice. The hydraulic engineering that enabled Angkor to support a population of over 1 million people required constant attention from administrators who understood both the technical and religious aspects of water management. The Sister Queen's involvement in these projects demonstrated her grasp of the practical challenges that faced their kingdom, while also reflecting the Buddhist understanding that proper governance required attention to the material welfare of all subjects. The successful management of this complex system became a symbol of the divine favor that their marriage was believed to attract. The diplomatic relations that the Khmer kingdom maintained with neighboring powers often involved recognition of the special spiritual status that their sibling marriage was understood to represent. Foreign ambassadors who visited Angkor were required to participate in ceremonies that acknowledged the cosmic significance of the royal union, understanding that these rituals were not merely courtly protocols but essential aspects of Khmer political theology. The international recognition of their spiritual authority enhanced the kingdom's diplomatic position throughout Southeast Asia. The artistic traditions that flourished during their reign reflected the synthesis of Hindu and Buddhist influences that characterized Khmer culture during this period. The Devata figures carved into temple walls often depicted divine couples whose relationships paralleled the earthly marriage of the royal siblings, creating a visual theology that explained the spiritual significance of their union. These artistic innovations influenced temple decoration throughout the region, spreading Khmer artistic and religious concepts across much of Southeast Asia. The administrative system that governed the Khmer kingdom combined traditional Cambodian practices with Buddhist principles of just governance, creating institutions that could accommodate the diverse populations under royal authority. The Sister Queen's role in developing these administrative innovations demonstrated her understanding that effective rule required both spiritual legitimacy and practical competence. Her contributions to legal reform and administrative efficiency became models that influenced Southeast Asian governance for centuries. The agricultural calendar that governed Khmer society was intimately connected to the religious ceremonies that the royal couple performed throughout the year, with planting and harvest festivals serving as occasions for demonstrating the cosmic harmony that their marriage represented. These celebrations combined practical agricultural instruction with spiritual observance, creating community events that reinforced both social bonds and religious beliefs. The success of these festivals in maintaining social cohesion demonstrated the effectiveness of combining political authority with religious leadership. The educational institutions that emerged during their reign reflected the Buddhist emphasis on learning and spiritual development that had become central to Khmer culture. The Sister Queen's patronage of these schools ensured that both religious and practical knowledge were transmitted to future generations, while also providing opportunities for talented individuals from all social backgrounds to advance through merit rather than birth. These educational innovations created a more flexible social system that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining cultural continuity. The military campaigns that extended Khmer authority throughout much of mainland Southeast Asia were conducted according to Buddhist principles that emphasized the protection of Dharma rather than mere territorial conquest. The royal couple's personal involvement in military planning reflected their understanding that warfare, when necessary, should serve religious and moral purposes rather than simple material gain. This approach to military policy created a distinctive Khmer style of imperial expansion that influenced regional politics for generations. The gentle decline that eventually overtook Angkor reflected broader changes in Southeast Asian political and economic patterns rather than any specific failures in royal policy or spiritual practice. The patient jungle vines that gradually reclaimed the great temples served as metaphors for the natural cycles of growth and decay that Buddhist philosophy taught were inevitable aspects of existence. The royal couple's acceptance of these changes demonstrated their understanding that even the greatest earthly achievements were ultimately impermanent. The architectural legacy that survived the political decline of the Khmer kingdom provided permanent testimony to the spiritual and artistic achievements that had characterized their reign. The temple complexes at Angkor became pilgrimage sites that continued to attract Buddhist devotees for centuries, while the irrigation systems they had built provided foundations for agricultural communities that persisted long after the royal court had departed. These physical remains served as reminders of the creative possibilities that could emerge from the synthesis of political authority and religious commitment. The influence of their reign extended throughout Southeast Asia, as neighboring kingdoms adopted Khmer innovations in art, architecture, and governance, while adapting them to local conditions. The model of royal sibling marriage that they had perfected became part of the political vocabulary of the region, providing legitimacy for rulers who sought to combine traditional authority with Buddhist principles. Their demonstration that spiritual and political leadership could be successfully integrated influenced Southeast Asian political culture for centuries. The memory of their partnership was preserved in the oral traditions and written chronicles that recorded the great achievements of the Angkor period, serving as inspiration for later rulers who sought to recapture the golden age of Khmer civilization. Their sister marriage had represented the culmination of centuries of Southeast Asian political and religious development, creating a synthesis of ancient traditions and Buddhist innovations that left a lasting impact on the cultural development of the entire region. Antiochus, Eye of Commagene, Laodice. The cool evening breeze swept across the throne platform atop Mount Nemrut as Antiochus I of Commagene and his sister Laodice gazed out over the Taurus Mountains that formed the backbone of their small but strategically crucial kingdom. The twilight sky painted the massive stone heads of gods and kings in shades of gold and purple, while the royal couple contemplated the delicate balance of power that enabled their realm to maintain independence between the competing empires of Rome and Parthia. Their sibling marriage represented a conscious effort to echo the divine twins of Greek mythology while incorporating the Persian royal traditions that had shaped the cultural identity of their unique Hellenistic kingdom. The Greek-Persian fusion court that Antiochus I had created reflected his ambitious vision of synthesizing the best elements of both civilizations into a new form of royal authority. The palace architecture combined classical Greek columns with Persian decorative motifs, while court ceremonies blended Hellenistic protocols with Zoroastrian religious observances. Laodice moved through this culturally complex environment with the confidence of someone who had been raised to understand that their kingdom's survival depended on its ability to serve as a bridge between different worlds, rather than choosing sides in the great power struggles of their era. The daily star-watching sessions that the royal couple conducted atop their mountain terraces served multiple purposes beyond mere astronomical observation. These evening rituals provided opportunities for private conversation about the diplomatic challenges that faced their kingdom, while also demonstrating their commitment to the astrological traditions that both Greek and Persian cultures considered essential for proper governance. The soft conversations conducted under lantern constellations often focused on interpreting celestial omens that might provide guidance for navigating the treacherous waters of international politics. The relief carvings that decorated their mountain sanctuary portrayed the royal siblings' calm handshake with eagles overhead, symbolic representations of the divine favor that legitimized their rule, while also emphasizing their partnership in governing the kingdom. These artistic programs were carefully designed to appeal to both Greek and Persian sensibilities, combining classical sculptural techniques with symbolic systems that would be understood by subjects from both cultural traditions. The monumental scale of these carvings reflected the royal couple's understanding that their small kingdom needed to project an image of grandeur that would command respect from larger neighbors. The diplomatic strategy that enabled Commagene to maintain its independence required constant attention to the shifting balance of power between Rome and Parthia, with the royal couple serving as skilled negotiators who could communicate effectively with representatives of both empires. Laodice's linguistic abilities proved particularly valuable in these encounters, as she could conduct conversations in Greek, Persian, and Armenian with equal fluency. Her cultural sophistication impressed foreign diplomats, while reinforcing Commodus' reputation as a center of learning and refinement. The religious synthesis that characterized their reign reflected Antiochus I's vision of creating a new form of monarchy that could appeal to subjects with diverse cultural backgrounds. The royal couple participated in ceremonies that honored both Greek and Persian deities, while also incorporating local Anatolian religious traditions that predated both classical civilizations. This inclusive approach to religious practice helped maintain social cohesion in a kingdom where different ethnic groups needed to cooperate for mutual survival. The economic prosperity that marked their reign was partly the result of Commodus' strategic position on the trade routes that connected the Mediterranean world with Central Asia and India. The royal couple's encouragement of commercial activity created a prosperous merchant class that provided the tax revenues necessary for maintaining the diplomatic and military resources that preserved their independence. The markets of their capital city buzzed with traders speaking dozens of languages, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere that reflected the kingdom's role as a cultural crossroads. The administrative innovations that emerged during their reign demonstrated the practical benefits that could flow from their synthesis of different governmental traditions. The legal system they developed combined Greek concepts of citizenship with Persian administrative practices, creating institutions that could accommodate the diverse populations under their authority. Laodice's involvement in legal reform reflected her understanding that effective governance required attention to the specific needs of different cultural communities. The artistic patronage that characterized their court attracted scholars and artists from throughout the Hellenistic world, creating an intellectual environment that rivaled the great cultural centers of Alexandria and Pergamon. The royal couple's support for literature, philosophy, and scientific research demonstrated their commitment to the classical ideal of enlightened monarchy, while also serving practical purposes by enhancing Commodus' reputation for cultural sophistication. These intellectual achievements provided soft power that complemented their diplomatic and military resources. The architectural projects that they commissioned reflected their understanding that monumental construction served both religious and political purposes in the ancient world. The sanctuary on Mount Nemrut became one of the most impressive religious complexes of the Hellenistic period, while the cities they founded or rebuilt provided models for urban planning that influenced architectural development throughout the region. These construction projects also provided employment for thousands of workers, contributing to the economic prosperity that characterized their reign. The military organization that defended their kingdom combined Greek tactical innovations with Persian strategic concepts, creating armed forces that could hold their own against the professional armies of the major powers. The royal couple's personal involvement in military planning reflected their understanding that diplomatic independence ultimately depended on the ability to defend their territory against potential invaders. Their success in maintaining neutrality during several major conflicts demonstrated the effectiveness of their approach to defense policy. The cultural legacy that survived the eventual absorption of Commodus into the Roman Empire provided lasting testimony to the creative possibilities that could emerge from the synthesis of different civilizations. The artistic and architectural innovations they had pioneered influenced development throughout the Eastern Mediterranean region, while their approach to religious syncretism became a model for other rulers who sought to govern diverse populations. The monuments they created continued to attract visitors for centuries, serving as reminders of a unique experiment in cross-cultural governance. The sleepy legacy of their forgotten micro-kingdom belies the historical significance of their achievement in creating a stable and prosperous state in one of the most contested regions of the ancient world. Their demonstration that small kingdoms could maintain independence through skillful diplomacy and cultural synthesis provided inspiration for other rulers who faced similar challenges. The memory of their reign was preserved in the inscriptions and monuments they had created, serving as testimony to the effectiveness of their collaborative approach to governance. The personal dimension of their relationship, with its combination of genuine partnership and political calculation, illustrated the human possibilities that could emerge from arranged marriages when both partners shared common goals and mutual respect. Their ability to work together effectively while maintaining the dignity and affection that characterized their private relationship provided a model for other royal couples who faced similar challenges. The preservation of their story in the archaeological record ensured that future generations would understand both the achievements and the sacrifices that had characterized their remarkable partnership. The influence of their reign extended beyond the immediate boundaries of their kingdom, as neighboring rulers adopted elements of their administrative and cultural innovations while adapting them to local conditions. Their approach to royal sibling marriage became part of the political vocabulary of the Hellenistic world, providing legitimacy for rulers who sought to combine different cultural traditions while maintaining their independence from larger powers. The legacy they created demonstrated that even small kingdoms could achieve historical significance through creative leadership and cultural innovation. Early Hittite Echo, Sapiluliyuma lineage sister bonds. The candlelit royal archive in Hattusa murmured with the constant activity of scribes whose reed pens scratched across clay tablets, recording the diplomatic correspondence and administrative documents that kept the Hittite Empire functioning across its vast territories. Among these cuneiform records were the carefully penciled entries that documented sister marriages as quiet stability measures, reflecting the Hittite understanding that royal sibling unions could provide crucial legitimacy during periods of succession uncertainty. The palace gardens where royal siblings tended calming terebinth saplings together served as peaceful refuges from the complex political calculations that governed their empire's relationships with Egypt, Assyria, and the other great powers of the Late Bronze Age. The Hittite approach to royal marriage reflected a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between domestic politics and international diplomacy that had developed over centuries of imperial experience. Unlike some of their contemporaries, Hittite kings used sister marriages sparingly, reserving them for specific circumstances where dynastic legitimacy needed reinforcement or where competing claims to the throne threatened imperial stability. The diplomatic tablets that recorded these unions were carefully crafted documents that explained the theological and political justifications for practices that foreign rulers sometimes found difficult to understand. The Sapiluliyuma lineage had established itself as one of the most successful dynasties in Hittite history, partly through their skillful use of marriage alliances that created networks of loyalty extending throughout their empire and beyond. The royal siblings who participated in these arrangements understood that their personal relationships served broader political purposes, but the archive records suggest that many of these marriages were also characterized by genuine affection and mutual respect. The careful attention that Hittite law codes gave to protecting the rights of royal women reflected a cultural understanding that effective governance required the active participation of competent individuals, regardless of gender. The palace workshops where royal siblings worked together on various projects provided opportunities for developing the collaborative relationships that would prove essential when they assumed positions of authority. These shared activities included everything from overseeing the production of luxury goods for diplomatic gifts to participating in the religious ceremonies that maintained the empire's relationship with its patron deities. The skills they developed through these experiences, negotiation, cultural sensitivity, and administrative competence, would prove invaluable when they faced the challenges of actual governance. The religious framework that governed Hittite royal marriage drew on ancient Anatolian traditions that predated the arrival of Indo-European peoples in the region by thousands of years. These indigenous beliefs had been synthesized with the religious concepts that the Hittites brought from their original homeland, creating a theological system that could accommodate diverse cultural influences while maintaining ideological coherence. The royal siblings, who participated in these religious traditions, understood that their marriages served cosmic as well as political purposes. The international dimensions of Hittite royal marriage became particularly apparent during the negotiations that preceded the famous peace treaty between Hattusili III and Ramesses II of Egypt. The diplomatic correspondence that has survived from this period reveals the careful attention that both sides paid to the marriage customs of their respective kingdoms, with each seeking to ensure that their diplomatic arrangements would be understood and respected by their negotiating partners. The successful conclusion of these negotiations demonstrated the importance of cultural sensitivity in international relations. The legal innovations that emerged during the Suppiluliuma period reflected the Hittite understanding that effective governance required clear rules for succession and inheritance that could prevent civil wars and dynastic disputes. The tablets that recorded these legal principles paid particular attention to the circumstances under which royal sibling marriages were appropriate and the procedures that should be followed when arranging such unions. These legal frameworks provided stability that enabled the Hittite Empire to survive for several centuries despite numerous external pressures. The artistic traditions that developed during this period often featured symbolic representations of royal couples that emphasized the harmony and balance that their marriages were supposed to represent. The relief carvings that decorated Hittite palaces and temples frequently depicted male and female figures in complementary poses, suggesting the cosmic significance that Hittite culture attached to the proper balance between masculine and feminine principles in governance. These artistic programs served both decorative and didactic purposes, explaining complex theological concepts through visual imagery. The military campaigns that extended Hittite authority throughout much of Anatolia and northern Syria were often conducted by royal siblings working in partnership, with one managing the administrative aspects of conquest, while the other focused on military strategy. This collaborative approach to imperial expansion reflected the Hittite understanding that successful governance required the integration of different skills and perspectives. The archival records from these campaigns provide detailed accounts of how these partnerships functioned in practice. The agricultural innovations that characterized Hittite rule were often implemented through the joint efforts of royal couples who understood that the empire's prosperity depended on the welfare of farming communities throughout their territories. The introduction of iron agricultural tools, the development of new irrigation techniques, and the establishment of grain storage systems all required the kind of coordinated effort that royal siblings were uniquely positioned to provide. These technological advances contributed to the economic prosperity that enabled the Hittite Empire to maintain its position among the great powers of the ancient world. The later myths that softened harsh war tales into gentle bedtime stories reflected the Hittite understanding that cultural transmission required the transformation of political and military events into narratives that could educate future generations while entertaining contemporary audiences. The stories that emerged from this process often emphasized the personal relationships between royal siblings rather than the broader political implications of their marriages, creating a literary tradition that preserved historical memory while making it accessible to popular audiences. The educational system that prepared royal children for their eventual responsibilities included detailed instruction in the diplomatic protocols that governed relationships with foreign powers, with particular attention to the cultural differences that could complicate international negotiations. Royal siblings learned to understand their personal relationships as aspects of their service to the empire, a perspective that helped them navigate the complex emotional and political challenges that these arrangements inevitably created. The skills they developed through this training enabled them to serve effectively as administrators, diplomats, and military commanders. The technological innovations that characterized the Hittite period were often the result of collaborative efforts between royal siblings who understood that imperial prosperity depended on maintaining technological superiority over potential enemies. the development of iron metallurgy, the improvement of chariot design, and the refinement of siege warfare techniques all benefited from the kind of sustained intellectual effort that royal partnerships could provide. These technological achievements contributed to the military effectiveness that enabled the Hittite Empire to compete successfully with Egypt and Assyria. The legacy of the Superlulioma lineage extended far beyond the immediate political achievements that marked their period of dominance, as their innovations in governance, law, and diplomacy influenced political development throughout the ancient Near East. Their approach to royal sibling marriage became part of the political vocabulary of the region, providing models that other dynasties could adapt to their own circumstances. The preservation of their historical records in the cuneiform archives at Hattusa ensured that their achievements would be remembered and studied by later generations. The cultural synthesis that characterized Hittite civilization during its golden age reflected the creative possibilities that could emerge when different traditions were skillfully combined under enlightened leadership. The royal siblings who participated in this cultural flowering understood that their personal relationships served as symbols of the broader harmony that enabled diverse populations to cooperate within the imperial framework. Their demonstration that political authority could be successfully shared between partners with complementary skills provided inspiration for later rulers who faced similar challenges. Meroé's Kandaki tradition. Unknown brother. Kings. The ruby sky stretched endlessly over the pyramid silhouettes that marked the royal necropolis of Meroe, where the powerful Kandaki queens of Nubia had ruled alongside their brother kings in a matrilineal tradition that inverted many of the gender assumptions governing royal authority elsewhere in the ancient world. The Nubian desert twilight painted the sandstone monuments in shades of gold and crimson, while the soft chanting in old Meroitic tones drifted across the archaeological landscape that preserved the memory of a civilization that had successfully resisted Roman expansion for over 3 centuries. The oral histories that survived the collapse of the Meroitic kingdom hinted at sister marriages designed to preserve the matrilineal serenity that was central to Nubian royal ideology, though the specific details of these arrangements remained frustratingly elusive to later scholars. The fragmentary inscriptions carved in the unique Meroitic script suggested that royal women possessed unprecedented authority in this African kingdom, with queens often serving as the primary rulers, while their male relatives occupied subordinate positions that reversed the gender hierarchies common throughout the Mediterranean world. The goldsmith workshops that had once rung with the measured hammer taps of skilled artisans provided archaeological evidence of the sophisticated material culture that had characterized Meroitic civilization at its height. The jewelry and ceremonial objects recovered from royal tombs revealed artistic traditions that synthesized Egyptian, Greek, and indigenous African influences while maintaining a distinctly Nubian aesthetic identity. The intricate goldwork often featured symbolic representations of royal couples that suggested the cosmic significance that Meroitic culture attached to the proper balance between male and female authority. The moonlit processions that had once moved along the banks of the Nile during the great religious festivals of the Meroitic calendar were preserved in temple reliefs that depicted royal siblings participating in ceremonies designed to maintain the kingdom's relationship with its patron deities. These artistic records suggested that brother-sister marriages served not only political purposes but also religious functions, with royal couples representing the divine principles that governed the natural cycles of flood and drought that determined the prosperity of Nubian agricultural communities. The strategic position of Meroe at the confluence of the Blue and White Niles had enabled the kingdom to control the trade routes that connected sub-Saharan Africa with the Mediterranean world, creating the economic foundation for the military and cultural achievements that characterized Nubian civilization during its golden age. The royal couples who governed this commercial empire understood that their authority depended partly on their ability to maintain relationships with trading partners who represented dozens of different cultures and political systems. The archaeological evidence from Meroitic sites suggested that royal women possessed property rights and legal status that exceeded those enjoyed by their counterparts in most ancient civilizations, reflecting cultural values that may have influenced the practice of royal sibling marriage in ways that differed significantly from patterns observed elsewhere. The tomb inscriptions that recorded the achievements of individual queens often emphasized their military and diplomatic accomplishments rather than their roles as wives and mothers, suggesting a political culture that valued competence over conventional gender roles. The resistance to Roman expansion that characterized Meroitic foreign policy required sophisticated military and diplomatic strategies that drew on the kingdom's unique position as the bridge between the Mediterranean and African worlds. The royal siblings who managed these complex relationships understood that their survival depended on their ability to play larger powers against each other, while maintaining the internal unity necessary for effective resistance. The successful defense of Nubian independence demonstrated the effectiveness of their collaborative approach to governance. The religious synthesis that emerged during the height of Meroitic power combined traditional African spiritual beliefs with Egyptian and Hellenistic influences, creating a theological system that could accommodate the diverse populations under royal authority while maintaining cultural distinctiveness. The royal couples who participated in these religious traditions understood that their marriages served to demonstrate the harmony between different cultural influences that characterized their kingdom's approach to governance. The artistic traditions that flourished under Meroitic patronage reflected the cultural confidence of a civilization that had successfully maintained its independence while adapting to changing circumstances throughout the ancient world. The palace decorations and temple reliefs often featured representations of royal couples that emphasized their partnership in governance, while also highlighting the special authority that Nubian culture accorded to royal women. These artistic programs served both aesthetic and political purposes, reinforcing the legitimacy of the matrilineal system while demonstrating the kingdom's cultural sophistication. The administrative innovations that enabled the Meroitic kingdom to govern territories stretching from the First Cataract to the confluence of the Niles required the development of bureaucratic systems that could accommodate diverse populations while maintaining centralized control. The royal siblings, who oversaw these administrative developments, understood that effective governance required attention to local customs and traditions, creating a federal system that preserved regional autonomy while ensuring imperial unity. The educational institutions that emerged during the Meroitic period reflected the kingdom's commitment to preserving indigenous African traditions while incorporating useful innovations from other civilizations. The development of the Meroitic script represented a conscious effort to create a writing system that could express African languages and concepts without depending entirely on foreign models. The royal couples who patronized these educational initiatives understood that cultural independence required intellectual as well as political autonomy. The diplomatic relations that the Meroitic kingdom maintained with neighboring powers often involved complex negotiations about the recognition of royal authority and the proper protocols for international communication. The unique position of Meroitic queens in these diplomatic encounters sometimes created confusion among foreign representatives who were accustomed to dealing with male rulers, but it also provided opportunities for innovative approaches to international relations that took advantage of cultural differences. The military organization that defended Meroitic independence combined traditional African warrior traditions with technological innovations borrowed from Mediterranean civilizations, creating armed forces that could compete effectively with the professional armies of Rome and other major powers. The royal couples who oversaw military policy understood that their kingdom's survival depended on maintaining technological parity with potential enemies while preserving the cultural values that motivated their subjects to fight for independence. The economic policies that sustained Meroitic prosperity were often implemented through the collaborative efforts of royal siblings, who understood that their authority ultimately depended on their ability to ensure the welfare of their subjects. The development of irrigation systems, the encouragement of craft production, and the regulation of trade all required the kind of sustained attention that royal partnerships were uniquely positioned to provide. These economic achievements contributed to the political stability that enabled the kingdom to survive for centuries. The legacy of the Meroitic kingdom extended far beyond its immediate political achievements, as its innovations in governance, art, and culture influenced development throughout northeastern Africa for centuries after the collapse of the royal dynasty. The model of shared authority between royal siblings became part of the political vocabulary of the region, providing inspiration for later rulers who sought to balance different sources of legitimacy while maintaining their independence from foreign domination. The mystery that still surrounds many aspects of Meroitic civilization reflects the loss of written records and the challenges facing archaeological research in the region. But the evidence that has survived suggests a sophisticated political culture that successfully combined African traditions with foreign influences while maintaining its distinctive identity. The royal sibling marriages that appear to have been central to this political system represented a unique approach to governance that deserves recognition alongside the better documented achievements of Mediterranean civilizations. Myth-steeped Sparta, Leonidas' siblings, and the quiet law. The olive groves of Lacedaemon rustled softly under the rising constellations as Spartan elders gathered in the shadowed corners of their austere meeting halls to discuss the rare yet legal option for sibling unions that existed within their ancient constitution. Unlike the elaborate royal courts of Egypt or Persia, Sparta maintained a deliberately sparse approach to such matters, preferring to let the law speak quietly rather than celebrate what other civilizations proclaimed with golden fanfare. The legal framework that permitted brother-sister marriage among the royal families stood as one of archaic Sparta's most closely guarded secrets, a provision that acknowledged practical necessity while maintaining the cultural reserve that characterized Lacedaemonian society. The gentle comparison with the royal twins myth that Spartan mothers whispered to their children by hearthlight drew parallels between the legendary Castor and Pollux and the earthly possibilities that faced their own royal offspring. These bedtime stories, told in the soft Doric dialect that distinguished Spartan speech from the more familiar Attic Greek, explained how the divine brothers had shared not only their immortality, but also their love for the same divine sisters. The tales served multiple purposes, providing entertainment for drowsy children while subtly preparing them for the unusual legal possibilities that might govern their own futures. The actual Spartan kings who ruled the dual monarchy had consistently avoided exercising this legal option, creating an atmosphere of intrigue that surrounded the theoretical practice rather than any documented examples. The ephors who advised the royal houses understood that the mere existence of the law served important political purposes, providing flexibility for succession crises while maintaining the mystique that surrounded Spartan royal prerogatives. This careful avoidance of the practice created a hush of speculation that proved more politically useful than any actual implementation could have been. The constitutional framework that governed Spartan royal succession reflected the unique political culture that had developed in response to the city-state's military necessities and social organization. The existence of two royal houses provided built-in checks and balances that prevented any single family from accumulating too much power, while the theoretical possibility of sibling marriage offered a last resort for maintaining dynastic continuity during periods of crisis. The legal scholars who maintained these constitutional traditions understood that their value lay as much in their potential as in their actual application. The military culture that dominated Spartan society created practical constraints on royal marriage that differed significantly from those facing monarchs in other Greek city-states. The emphasis on physical fitness and military preparedness meant that royal women were expected to participate in athletic training that would have been considered inappropriate in other societies, while royal men faced constant pressure to demonstrate their worthiness through martial achievement. These cultural expectations influenced the way that marriage alliances were evaluated and implemented. The religious traditions that surrounded Spartan royal authority drew on ancient Dorian customs that predated the classical period by several centuries, creating a theological framework that could accommodate unusual marriage practices when political necessity demanded them. The dual kingship itself reflected religious beliefs about the need for balance between different divine principles, while the elaborate funeral rites that honored deceased rulers emphasized their semi-divine status in ways that paralleled practices in other societies where royal sibling marriage was more common. The economic organization of Spartan society, with its emphasis on communal property and shared responsibilities, created social conditions that were significantly different from those in monarchies, where royal marriage served primarily to consolidate private wealth and territorial claims. The royal family's participation in the common messes and their obligation to contribute to communal defense meant that their marriage choices had implications for military effectiveness as well as political legitimacy. The diplomatic relations that Sparta maintained with other Greek city-states often involved complex negotiations about marriage alliances that could strengthen military coalitions or neutralize potential threats. The theoretical possibility of royal sibling marriage provided Spartan negotiators with additional flexibility in these discussions, even though the practice was never actually implemented. Foreign diplomats understood that they needed to take this legal option into account when calculating the long-term implications of their agreements with Sparta. The educational system that prepared young Spartans for their adult responsibilities included instruction in the constitutional principles that governed their society, though the details of royal marriage law were typically reserved for those who might actually need to apply them. The emphasis on practical citizenship rather than theoretical knowledge meant that most Spartans remained unaware of the specific provisions that permitted sibling marriage, contributing to the aura of mystery that surrounded the royal prerogatives. The cultural impact of the unused law extended beyond its immediate political implications, as the mere existence of this legal option influenced Spartan attitudes toward family relationships and social organization more generally. The emphasis on collective rather than individual interests that characterized Spartan society made it easier to contemplate marriage arrangements that served state purposes rather than personal preferences, even if such arrangements were never actually implemented. The military campaigns that established Spartan hegemony throughout the Peloponnese were often conducted by royal commanders who understood that their authority depended partly on their ability to maintain the mystique that surrounded their constitutional prerogatives. The theoretical possibility of extraordinary marriage arrangements contributed to this mystique, suggesting that Spartan kings possessed powers that went beyond those available to ordinary military commanders. The philosophical traditions that emerged from Spartan political culture emphasized the importance of law and constitutional order in maintaining social stability, with particular attention to the role that flexibility and adaptability played in ensuring institutional survival. The provision for royal sibling marriage represented one example of this constitutional flexibility, demonstrating the founders' understanding that effective governance required the ability to adapt to extraordinary circumstances. The artistic traditions that developed in Sparta, though more restrained than those in other Greek city-states, often featured symbolic representations of divine twins and royal partnerships that reflected the cultural values underlying their political system. The bronze work and carved reliefs that decorated Spartan temples frequently depicted complementary figures whose relationships paralleled the theoretical possibilities that existed for their own royal families. The legacy of Spartan constitutional innovation extended throughout the Greek world, as other city-states adapted elements of Lacedaemonian political organization to their own circumstances. while maintaining their distinctive cultural characteristics. The provision for royal sibling marriage became part of the broader conversation about the relationship between law and necessity that influenced political development throughout the classical period. The mysterious nature of this unused legal provision contributed to the broader fascination that later Greek and Roman writers expressed regarding Spartan political culture, with historians and philosophers speculating about the circumstances that might have prompted the inclusion of such an extraordinary option in their constitution. These scholarly discussions helped preserve awareness of the provision even after the political circumstances that had made it relevant had long since disappeared. The preservation of this constitutional possibility in Spartan law demonstrated the founders' sophisticated understanding of the relationship between legal theory and political practice, showing how the mere existence of extraordinary options could serve important political purposes, even when they were never actually implemented. The wisdom of this approach became apparent during later constitutional crises, when the flexibility built into the original system enabled Sparta to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining institutional continuity.